Hey guys, welcome to the CSS Crash Course. This is the continuation of an HTML crash course on my channel called Web Crunch. If you check that out, or web-crunch.com. I'm also going to be in the process of creating a new course called hellohtmlcss.com. It's kind of more comprehensive version of this, so definitely check that out if you're interested. So this will cover CSS explicitly. This course is for absolute beginners. And if you're new to HTML, like I said, I just finished up my HTML crash course, so definitely check that out. We'll be using the current standard of CSS3. And then I just want to reiterate that learning this code takes time. CSS is one of those things that it's basically an open box. You can spend years using the language and just discover new things every day. New features are being added and that are like mind-boggling in terms of like animations or how things can be interacted with just with some sprinkles of CSS. So it's really cool language. It takes almost a lifetime to perfect, in my opinion. But as you get more comfortable with it, as you practice a lot, it's going to be a lot more fluid when you're typing it out. You kind of visualize a design as you go. Like I said before, check out hellohtmlcss.com. That's my new more in-depth course that will cover both HTML and CSS. We'll use practical projects to put the two languages to use and just kind of give you the real foundational stuff you need to get a website built and understand what you're doing out of the gate. So what is CSS? CSS is a cascading style sheets, and we'll get into what cascading means later on, but style sheets are essentially a rule-based language that allow you to define rules that specify groups of styles, in this case the aesthetics of something, that would be applied to particular elements or groups of elements on your web page. So coming from HTML, I'd recommend doing that first. That crash course, like I said, on my channel, you'll find it. That'll kind of explain what these HTML elements are and how you define what they are and like what content is on your web page. CSS can target those things and manipulate it with different styles, is what they're called. CSS isn't a programming language, but you'll notice it's on every website you see, no matter the design. So why you might learn CSS? For most, I think you would learn it to enable yourself to do more at your job or find a job that, enables you to use it. A lot of people have started, like myself, on the side of working somewhere else, just coding websites for money. You start off small, get bigger, and over time you kind of either become a professional with it or just start building things and make money from that on the side. They also enable you to kind of progress with these new no-code tools that are on the market. That's kind of all the hype at the moment. But if I've undertaken like maybe a Webflow project or similar, you start to see this language in the tool set that may not be clear. And knowing a bit of HTML or CSS would definitely make that easier on yourself and just whoever you're working with at the time. So you might use CSS to also build your own websites and your brand. I started off as a designer first, and HTML and CSS were the code I could understand in the beginning. Since transitioned into more programming, but that's aside from the point. You kind of have this foundational language to learn upon to build basic websites and kind of just design your own take on things, which is what a designer typically wants to do. They want to have something that they created, has their own flair. So then also you might want to learn CSS and particularly HTML too, just to have a more foundational understanding of building websites. And maybe before you do anything too more complicated, you want to learn those basics first. Tools to author CSS, you basically need just a browser and some sort of code editor. You can use anything you want, any browser you want almost, and just go to town. A text or code editor that are pretty popular includes Sublime Text 3, Visual Studio Code, Atom, and basically anything that has syntax highlighting. Syntax highlighting is just a way to kind of define those rules that you see in the code. So it's more color coded in a way, so you can easily scan it and identify things as you're actually coding. Typically with code, the lines just grow. So as you code more and more, it'll be easier to see with some sort of syntax highlighting. In this course, I'll use Visual Studio Code. So the building blocks of a CSS file, it has a .css extension on the file name. It also runs in a web browser natively, so you won't need to really do anything to get it up and running. You can just open it, assuming it's linked within an HTML file or actually embedded in an HTML file. You can see the styles applied. It can contain various selectors that target HTML elements directly. And then styles can cascade, which basically means they inherit from other styles up the chain. So it's kind of this parent-sibling concept where if a parent has a style, its sibling can inherit from it and manipulate it on its own. And we'll get into more what that means and how that looks soon. So the syntax on the left here, you see a dot notation, so a period before the name. It's called a class. That's how a class looks. An ID is going to have the number sign and then the name of the element or whatever ID you pass in the HTML. And then the P tag is an actual HTML element itself. So you can style things in these specific ways and a few more, which we'll get into. The syntax itself has these braces, so the open and close braces, and then the rules and values, or those rules and values that dignify what's going to set. So in this case, it could be color, font sizes, padding or pushing things around on this page, etc. Basically, any CSS selector is an HTML class that you've defined in HTML first, and then using that thing or definition, you can go and actually target it with CSS directly. Each line on the CSS rule and declaration is going to need a semicolon to be considered valid code. So you want to make sure you have that after each line. And with CSS, you can apply as unlimited properties and values as each selector you want. So it's basically endless. So how does CSS actually work? This is actually sourced from MDN, the website basically with a ton of information about the web and how it works. But the HTML page is first loaded, it's parsed, and then as it's parsed, the CSS is loaded and parsed. So you'll notice the HTML typically loads first, even then links to the CSS, which is then loaded and parsed, and it creates this tree in the DOM, which DOM means document object model. And it's essentially creates these HTML-based nodes in the web page that can be targeted with CSS specifically. So that tree is what you're able to target and is how cascading works in a sense, which we'll get into more of. So here's the steps that I stole from MDN as well. We can run through each real quick. So the first is the browser loads the HTML and it converts it. Step 2, it converts it into the DOM or document object model. The DOM represents the document in the computer's memory. The third step is the browser then fetches the most of the resources that are linked by the HTML document. And that could be images or videos or JavaScript, and then of course CSS. And once that's fetched, the browser can then parse that fetched stuff, so the CSS in this case, and then sort it based on the selectors that you pass, which are kind of in different buckets. So whether it's a CSS class or an ID, it kind of sorts it on its own and makes sure it applies them at the right time and right order. So based on these selectors, it works out which rules it should be applied, and then the nodes in the DOM, and attaches the style to them as required. The render tree, it's kind of called the render tree in that immediate step, is laid out in the structure it should appear after the rules have been applied to it. So finally, the visual display of the page is shown on the screen. It's called painting. So you might hear this term paint, or the time it takes to paint that passed around on the web. It's just kind of a performance kick. So you can use as much CSS you want on a page, but the more you use, the longer that paint effect takes. So you got to keep that in mind as you're creating a website. So how does CSS actually get applied? So we've got this example. I've created some HTML on the left. It's got a P tag. It's got 3 span tags. And then within it, we can render that page, and you'll see the nodes on the right, HTML DOM nodes, get rendered and their own specific nodes. So it's kind of got a tree effect if you can see it. So there's actually text content between these HTML elements. And then from there, we can target those elements specifically with this span tag, since there's 3 of them. And then what that does with CSS is it targets all the span tags and adds this border that's a solid black border, and then it adds the background color that's called lime, which on the right, on the bottom right there, you see the actual output, which again, I took this markup and HTML and CSS from MDN, but I wanted to visualize it in a little bit different way than they did. So what's a CSS selector? And these are the things you use to target your actual HTML element, and they can come in very different degrees of styles. So the first is type, class, and ID. So type is actual HTML element itself. So in this case, like an H1 or an H2, a div, a p tag, whatever it is, anything in HTML can be targeted directly with CSS. And then in your HTML, you can add a class attribute as well. So in this case, we could add, maybe it's a div where we added class equals box. And in a way you can target a class is using the period before the name. And that basically allows you to create a reusable CSS target, or selector, I should say, that allows you to kind of reapply a certain style to many things as opposed to just one. An ID is kind of the same thing, but it's more unique. You almost always apply it to one specific thing as opposed to many, like a class. And then the type would work in a similar way, but just applies to any H1 on the page, assuming it's at the top level. So attribute selectors are a way to target specific types of inputs or something like that. So in this case would be input type of text. There's many input types, so maybe there's an input type of email you could target with CSS, all the same. The rules would go in between those curly brackets. I'm just showing you there, for example. And you can even target attributes by like an actual link of an anchor tag. So an href would have an actual URL that points to google.com. You can actually target it directly with CSS, which is pretty explicit. Then there's these pseudo classes and pseudo elements, which are ways to target the interactivity of the element. So maybe on a link, you might have a hover effect that when applied, the CSS changes it. So when you hover over a link, maybe a line is indicated or shown, or the text gets bold or something like that. That's all the same. And then combiners just kind of take these precedents of anything with, like in this example, an unordered list would target all the LIs within that parent. The box model. This is an important concept to kind of nail down, because there's different types of box models that you can apply to an element, but there's one that kind of reigns supreme. It's called border box. And this is the base box model. Then I think it's called, what is it called? Standard box model that you see by default in a browser. So there's the main border around the content. Then there's padding, if there is any. And then around the border is the margin. So the margin is going to push off from the element. The padding is going to push in. The border is going to wrap the element or the content. And then the contents is going to remain inside. So it'll always be that way, depending on the box sizing you set. So the box has a actual box sizing CSS declaration you can add that allows you to kind of change that thing. So for many, I think the most popular, as indicated here, is border box, and that wraps the content and any padding, and its size and style can be controlled using border and related properties. So I won't go through each of these because they're kind of, I think, not as commonly used, but in most cases you're going to see a lot of websites just use border box, sometimes padding box, depending on what you want to do with the actual box-based element. So one thing to note that may not be obvious, but everything on a website is a box in the end. It may not look like it, but any element is going to have either a inline based box or a full width based box that's the full span of the browser. And that's just the way it's designed. So anything you can manipulate, you can change the shape, you can curve the corners, you can do whatever. You can make it a circle if you want with CSS. But in the end, it's going to be within a box-based thing. And here's, again, we're going into that element of block and inline display block. I've covered this, I think, in the HTML Crash Course, but this one is good to reiterate. An inline-based element is going to only take its own width. So the width and height properties are basically ignored if you set those with CSS. So if you display it as an inline property, which we'll get into all this, this is a lot of overview first. We'll actually ignore the width and height. Inline elements don't break to a line. They stack horizontally if duplicated instead of vertically. And then examples might include a span tag or an M tag. These kind of are ways to target text itself as opposed to like making a shape or a new block element that gives you a new place to do something new. A block element is going to take up the entire width of the line, so it'll span the whole width of your browser. Its width and height properties are respected. It breaks to a new line every time it's used, and then it stacks vertically if duplicated. So examples there include div, h1, p, and there's a plenty of each of these as you begin to explore building websites more. So cascade, this is an important one, and it's kind of commonly misunderstood. So the order of your rules matter, and the last rule being applied is going to always take precedence when using the same selector. So here we've got two H1s. Again, I took this source from MDN. They have great examples over there. But if you declare an H1 twice in your CSS file and they're at the same hierarchy stance in the file, the last one in line or like furthest to the bottom is going to always take precedence. So this blue is going to take precedence over the color red in this case. Specificity is the measure of how specific a selector's selection is. So that's confusing. But if you have an H1, that's a type of selector, and you color it blue, but then you add a class to it, that specificity is a little bit more than the named attribute itself. So in this case, just targeting the H1 won't work to color it blue if you add a class called main heading and color it red. So in this case, that class is going to take precedence. Inheritance. So some CSS property values set on the parent elements are inherited by their child elements, and some aren't. Some will be like the width property, for instance, won't inherit to a parent's children, for example, making each child have a width of equal amount. So what that means, if like you have a parent div or wrapping element that has a strict width, so say you set it to 500 pixels or 50%, you can use those elements of measure. The children won't have that width, so you'd have to set width 100 or change that width accordingly if you need it different. It'll ignore it thanks to inheritance. So in this case, to the right, we were setting the body color to blue, but you notice if we set the span tag, it's a global span, so it's targeting all spans in the HTML document. It's going to be applied black, and that's just the way the inheritance rule works. So even if it's enclosed within the body, the span tag's outside of the spectrum. It's like within the body itself. So in HTML, you might have the body tag. Well, the span tag's inside of it. So it's going to go ahead and inherit that black class, and then the rest will inherit the blue. So I mentioned before, like a width unit. This is values in units typically used in CSS. Some are very much more common than others, but you might see some of this stuff tossed around in different applications or uses. So absolute length units generally are considered to be always the same size. So in this case, it could be centimeters, millimeters, inches, picas, points, and pixels. You'll see commonly it being pixels for absolute units in CSS, probably almost 99% that. Relative length units are usually relative to something else. So perhaps the size of the parent element's font or the size of the browser itself. So those range. I've seen pretty much all these except that last one EX used. But rem is kind of a golden standard. M as well, scalable things, so that it's relative to like a container or a type size or something. So if you want your font to scale, for instance, if you stretch your screen really wide, you would do that with this type of unit. And percentages are commonly used for like a width or height attribute. You can use them for pretty much anything, but that's where I see them used most, because it's usually when you're setting up a layout, for instance, maybe you make a grid, 3-column grid or something. You would use either % and set that up, or just some sort of offset to do that. And percent just makes sense because as you move your browser around, you have to think that width will scale proportional to the actual browser, and a fixed width there wouldn't really be helpful. So the percent kind of makes up for that. Within CSS, there are lots of color options as well. So typically you'll probably see hex and RGB be used the most. HSL is common as well, depending on what you're going to use. And then there's an actual alpha fourth level that allows you to adjust the opacity of a color as well, which is very powerful. So you can set color just using explicit keywords that ship with browsers, and that's pretty handy thanks to just some built-ins. Can't say I use a ton with those besides black or white, but there are some useful colors that kind of just give you an advantage to go real fast as opposed to remembering one of these color codes. Hexadecimal is probably the most common used color code, or the way of using color in CSS. Although RGB and RGBA are a quick second. Hexadecimal is probably always going to be non-transparent color. So it could be anything from white to black. The 000, the 6 characters there with a number sign preceding them are going to dictate what color comes back. The first there, the 000, 6 zeros is black, whereas the 5 or 6 Fs is white. And then there's like a weird, I think that's a greenish color to the right on the third, on the hexadecimal RGB. You can use any kind of like photo editor or graphic design tool to kind of use an eyedrop or eye picker tool to kind of get these colors if you're not sure what they are. They're insanely hard to remember. The less common ones, you almost have to use a tool like that or some third-party tool. And then RGB is another way of just rendering colors in the same way. It just uses a red, green, blue spectrum. And then I'll commonly use RGBA, which is red, green, blue, alpha, which allows you to add some transparency or opaqueness to your color. And it's a great way of just adding like subtle shadows or something to your elements where you need them. And then HSL is pretty much the same way. It's just based in percentages. It's just another way of calculating color, and it uses hue, saturation, and lightness. So one thing with CSS is that some browsers handle styles differently than others. So you might see that either colors are different or fonts look a little different depending on the browser you use. It's hard to always control that, and it makes coding for websites one of those pretty challenging things, but in coming years, as more browsers become more modern, they're coming a long way. It used to be a lot harder. So if you're just coming into it, you've considered yourself lucky because it's been very hard in the past to kind of get things consistent between browsers. You'd have to do a lot of hacks to make things work. So if a browser is parsing your CSS rules and encounters a neat feature, I should say, is if a browser is parsing your CSS rules and encounters a property it doesn't really understand, it just ignores it instead of erroring or stopping, and just moves on to the next one. And that's nice because if you add any new bleeding edge feature in CSS, it allows you to either add it and use it depending on your browser, and then incorporate callbacks or fallbacks if you don't have support. So assuming you have the fallbacks, which you should if you're using bleeding edge stuff, you're allowed to use this real neat new stuff if you want to. So that wraps up the slide portion of the crash course. I want to jump into creating what will be a continuation of our HTML crash course next. It's going to be styling a resume website that's going to include blog posts and a bunch of form fields, so you can get used to the HTML elements, how to approach them with CSS, and then just get used to coding CSS in itself. So we'll do that next. Okay guys, so like I said in the very beginning, we're going to be using our HTML from my HTML crash course to basically build this resume website. And this is the final product you see here. We've got, as you can see, background color, an image, the actual resume with an avatar. This isn't a real person, but it's just a fictional person that I'm using for this example. And what we're going to be building is this basically multi-page resume style of website. So on it is, of course, the resume. And within that is also like a blog space with some dummy data for now, but that's just mostly to show context. And I'm basically rendering some dummy images as well from a third-party service, and then just styling things accordingly. So the blog itself will have its own like sub-children pages. Each is unique based on the actual paths we pass via the HTML. But you'll notice some things different about each blog post. We'll just add some styling as we go on. So there's a block quote here, for instance. We can style it a little bit different than the regular text. And then finally on the contact form, we're going to have all these fields styled in a certain way. You notice like as I cursor into the field, there's a shadow and a little border that's purple. We can customize that, to your heart's content, basically, with CSS. So here, I just kind of went through all the inputs in the HTML crash course and just kind of went through them briefly. But we can really style these a lot more than what you see here. I've gone and done the basics, so you have a good grasp of how to reach for those and actually target them with CSS. And then you notice as I'm entering different pages, there's a little bit of a fade, or in this case on the contact, it slides up. That's kind of some CSS as well. That's more of the animation side of it. And all this is to say that this is actually responsive too. So with responsive web design, it needs to adapt to different widths. And commonly you'll be able to visit these pages on a mobile device like your iPhone or your Android device or something like that, and see the same website. And you can actually design it a different way with CSS and target those different widths, which are variable, and design things a little bit different. So that's what we're going to really target. I'm going kind of a mobile first approach, which is kind of a common convention where you start with your mobile view and start to expand on how that will look as it gets and grows wider. To enter this mode on Firefox, I hit Option Command I on my Mac. It might be Alt Command or Alt Control I on your PC. I'm not 100% sure what that would be on a PC, to be honest. But we've got just a different layout, as you can see. So when I go back to my desktop view, it's a bit different. Just kind of fills the page a bit more, which is good. And then that's about it. So what I want to do is just kind of kick things off, use our HTML from that first course, which I'll link to. It's all going to be within a repo called CSS Crash Course. You don't need to know Git or version control to do this. This is just a great place for me to host code. You can find and download this repo just by downloading the zip file and opening it on your machine. Or if you want to use Git, you can kind of go through a little like a tutorial online or something like that and just download it that way. It's a great way to kind of keep your code from being, overwritten in a certain way if you want to. Maybe I'll do another course on Git as I go on. But what I've outlined in this repo is pretty much the slides you saw in the very beginning of this course. And I just kind of did a written format to kind of give you more of a readable version as opposed to just slides. So we do change some markup in this course. I only do that mainly to grab certain elements on the page with CSS holistically, so you can target them as a group as opposed to more of a global way of targeting things. So we'll get in more of that in a second, but what I want to do first is download this to my machine. I'll do it the very manual way just so you can follow along. I'll download this zip. This will be linked in the description as well as my blog post that's going to accompany this, so check that out. But we'll link to this and download that. And I'll just save it to my downloads folder. Okay, so I pulled that from my downloads folder. I'm going to unzip it just by double clicking it on a Mac. And we can toss this zip file away. And what I want to do is rename this to CSS Crash Course. And it's going to basically just live on my desktop for now. And we'll grab it and add it to our Visual Studio Code instance. And I'll open this in a new window so we have it open. I had my previous project open there. I'll just keep this full screen for now. Now I do have an extension in my VS Code editor that's going to be called Live Preview. And I have this installed. It's really useful for the sake of like a reloading after you save in your style sheets. So you don't need this, but you will find yourself refreshing your browser over and over and over again if you don't use something like this. It's up to you. This is a quick and easy install, so I didn't want to go through the whole pain of setting something like this up manually. But this is built into VS Code. If you're using VS Code, I bet other code editors have something similar. If you're on something pretty modern like Atom or Sublime Text, maybe just do a search for an extension to see if something like that exists. So let's start. What I want to focus on first is just defining where the style sheet lives in an HTML file. At this point, if we were to pull this file up and go live with it, I'll just click this button here using that extension we just installed. You'll notice it points me to this page is what it looks like. And I'll get rid of those real quick, as well as this. And this is just basic HTML. There's no CSS involved in this page besides some inline stuff we added in the crash course. You'll see some, like right here, I added styles inline, which is totally valid styles. You can even add a block attribute of styles within the head here. That's more of a kind of global thing. So you could target all H1s, maybe to have font color pink. So I'll just get rid of, it's actually not font color. So we'll target, for instance, all H1s might have a color of pink. And we can target that with an actual named color that comes with CSS. We can change that to a hex code at any time too if we want to, like I mentioned in the slides. It's up to you basically how you want to author your CSS. So it's quite an open-ended language to write, but it is pretty forgiving at the same time. So you notice now the H1 there is going to always be pink, and that's just global. So that works. You notice as you grow or write more and more styles, this is just going to make this file massive. So a common convention, and one that's probably more suggested, is to actually link to a style sheet. And you can actually embed those styles from another file as opposed to doing it right in line. And you'll find yourself being able to write more CSS in that way. It's more organized, so you won't be searching one long file to get something done and styled. Because you will, with HTML at this current point, you will need to copy styles per file, and just linking to one externally makes that a lot easier. So you're copying one line as opposed to a ton of actual selectors and values that you enter with CSS. So let's do that first. I'll just do a link, and my code editor is probably going to auto fill this for me. I just hit tab after that link, and it defaults to this rel statement, and it basically just says resolve to a style sheet. So what that's going to look for and tell the browser to is link up an actual style sheet based on what we passed in the href space. So because I'm going to add a file globally in our project, we won't need to pass any type of folder structure here, which you might commonly see in larger projects. Instead, we could just say styles.css. And with that in mind, before we get any bugs, we can just say styles.css to pass that through. So that's going to link this up. If I save HTML file and then just put maybe a body tag of background blue, you notice the whole website becomes blue as a background. So that is working, and that's how you link up an actual style sheet. Now, this, if you recall the syntax in the slides, this is basically targeting a type of body, which we have in this file right there. That's one, there can only be one body tag in an HTML file. So you can target it directly, or you can maybe pass a class and just call it body, or even an ID if you want to. So an ID would maybe not make sense in the most cases in this particular element, but you might want to target it, you know, in a certain way. So I'll actually get rid of our current inline styles on this demonstration and take those out of the picture so we don't have to deal with any conflicts of styles. One thing to mention, that inline styles are more dominant than any styles you define in here. So if you mix those two, the ones in your HTML are always going to take precedence and just kind of be the ones that are higher up on that hierarchy tree. So that specificity is going to be higher in that case. So anytime if you're writing inline CSS, it's going to always take precedence. So let's go through and clean up some of this inline style. It's going to be on multiple files, so it shouldn't be too much, but I want to just clean this up accordingly. You notice when I save my file, it kind of formats it. That's also my code editor doing that. It's just a built-in thing. You don't need to worry about it if you don't want to. But it's just kind of a quality of life thing that I prefer. It just adjusts the indentation and whatnot. So that is, each blog post has padding on the body, and that's about it. So let's leave those alone. Okay, so since we linked up this style sheet to the index file, I actually want to do the same on each file. So I'll go through each and just link that up as the contact page, then each blog post. Just the same file. It doesn't need to be anything fancy there. One thing I did notice is this should probably be maybe blog post, kind of continuing my HTML tutorial in the CSS one isn't probably a good idea, but that's okay. So just for the sake of my OCD, I will add this through just so we have a unique title per page. For search engines, if you have unique pages, a Google search will be able to index that page separately as opposed to the rest. So that makes more sense. Now, we haven't defined any styles besides this body background of blue yet. I'm actually going to remove that and just start clean now that we have something to go off of. So with CSS, you can define specific fonts that you want to use in your project. Some come baked into the browser by default, and those are useful. They're called system fonts typically in the space, or you might use something like a sans serif or a serif based on typography. So with that in mind, I'm actually going to reach for a third-party font that's hosted on the Google Fonts library. It's called Enter. And it's a pretty common font right now, and it's one that you can use just linking up to this. It's like a third-party link to another site so that we link essentially the same way as we do this style sheet here locally. So instead of just saying the file name, we'll actually link to a full URL or an actual website that's going to link to that style and load it to our site, which is the power of internet at its work. So I've gone and done this, set up the configuration on this actual website. If you search for this name, Enter, you'll be able to find this font on fonts.google.com. And then I've added the styles regular, bold, and black. And those are just different weights you can see. So regular is probably something you use for body copy or something with more text. And bold becomes useful for headings or something that you need to really stand out. So what I'll do, there's two ways you can link these up in your actual HTML or CSS. The link, like I said before, is probably the more common method. You can add this to your HTML and be ready to roll. But since this is a CSS course, I want to just do the @import to show you that concept. You can link that up using this @import symbol in your style sheet. So what I'll do is that. And to be fair, I probably prefer the link with the HTML because that really won't change much. But the @import is kind of useful for the sake of just running CSS the way you want to write it. So this will be the first thing we add to our app. And you notice it's the full URL. It's going to pass that through. It's going to link that up. And we're able to load specific fonts in that case. So typically you would write what that font would be when you define a font family. Before we do that, though, I want to talk about quickly CSS variables, which are kind of brand new to the CSS world, and a way to define instances of CSS that are going to allow you to make it more dynamic and reusable. The idea behind a variable is allows you to reference that one variable and change it in one place as opposed to many, and you'll see the power of that in a second. A way to define variables is using a root instance like this. So it's kind of like its own selector that's just built into CSS that allows you to define variables globally. And you can define variables inside an element even. So you could just say body color, and this is how the syntax looks. So you could just say maybe black for that. And again, my code editor does this automatically for me. I don't believe it's an extension. I think it's just part of the code editor, but I could be wrong. I'll try to link that stuff up if I find that it's a third party. But this is how you could declare a variable in CSS at this time. And this may change in the future, but I think it's pretty standard at this point. So instead of just defining it within this scope of the selector, we're going to define it globally so we can access it on maybe if I have more tags or some class or some ID that I'm targeting with CSS. We can define and use that variable across each of those as opposed to just that one, because if it's defined within the actual selector, it's only usable within that. You can't use it in another selector. So hopefully that makes sense. So what I wanted to establish here is just get some basic colors. If you saw the quick demo I shared, we used kind of a purplish color and then maybe a secondary green color for hover state on some elements, and then of course some grays and whites, and then of course our texts or our fonts that I'm going to link up here that we've just imported. So in CSS you can actually import URLs like this in another language called SAS or SCSS. Maybe you've seen that or have heard of it. You can actually import style sheets into other style sheets, which is kind of powerful. We won't be covering much SAS or SCSS in this course. This is more meant for the very beginner version of CSS developers. So what I want to first define is a font size. That's just going to be my global font size. I'm going to define either on the body or just wherever it makes sense. Defining this globally makes sense just so you have this one understood unit of value for your typography that you can always expand upon or change as you go down the way. This is really great for staying consistent as well. So I'll say just a couple font sizes. So font size small will be 14 pixels, so slightly smaller. And font size large, just abbreviating there, for 24 pixels. Now these are absolute units of measurement, and I just covered that on my slides. You'll see a mix out there of people who use something like ems, rems, or even picas, I think, points, whatever you want to use. Those are useful. These are relative. So rem and em are relative, so they increase as a parent size increases, while pixels are absolute. So it'll never change in size unless you actually define it in a way or in a media query, which is how you kind of do that responsiveness I was talking about, to change the size of the font at a certain width or height. More on that as we go on. So let's define a primary color, and I'm inventing these names, by the way, so this isn't anything that comes with CSS. What I'll get into when we start writing actual CSS and styling things is actually the language that you need to use. And these are names that you're going to find over and over again when you're defining certain styles as you need to. You notice each line, as I said in the slides, requires a semicolon. We're using the curly braces here to define the variables within the root instance, or the selector in this case. And this won't be visible. It's not targeting anything, but it is giving us that root access that I just said earlier, where you can use a variable, in this case, anywhere in your CSS as opposed to just in one selector. So I'm going to go through these and talk about them in a second. Maybe the colors make sense. We're using the hex code values here as I defined in my slides, but these are, like I said, invented names. So I'm just going up kind of my own little invented variable names to go from gray or a darker gray to a lighter gray. And then below here, you might notice a lot of text that's just defining our fonts. And I'm defining one as a serif, which is kind of the way that the font looks. Maybe if you see, commonly it's in books, so it's kind of more of a curly look and feel as opposed to real rigid. And then sans is the typography. Sans is the typography that looks more rigid and real geometric. So there's two different types there. Typography is a whole nother course worth talking about, but we'll leave that alone for now. But the main thing here is this one has that kind of more elegant look, and this has that more rigid look. The serif and the ordering of these things, you see they're comma separated with the colon, semicolon at the end. And what's happening here is basically per browser, there's going to be different variances in how fonts render, what fonts render, and why and when. But what we want to do first is just to set a global UI serif that if it's not present, we'll fall back to one called Georgia. And then it'll kind of go down this tree if those still aren't present. And you'll see with Times New Roman, for instance, it's 3 words. So we need to actually string that together with quotation marks. And doing that, if basically for multi-word quotation mark or for multi-word fonts or more custom fonts, I find that if you just go ahead and use those, it's going to be a safer bet as opposed to just kind of winging it and not using them. And the same is true for sans, so that we'll use the actual font we linked up right here called enter, and that's how you set that. So we'll set it to a variable, which we'll use in a second. That's going to be a global. And then we'll use this system font for a fallback. A system font's more or less the font that's just automatically installed on your system. It comes by default in your Mac or your PC or whatnot. And it's just what can be used if nothing else is present or this font fails to load, for instance. And it just goes down that tree, as you can see. So hopefully that makes sense. It's just kind of a fallback, a way to kind of be there to capture and use a font given that it may not be there or load correctly. And CSS and HTML are pretty forgiving in that way. So if it doesn't recognize something, it kind of just moves on and renders the best it can. So let's define that. One extra thing I'd like to do, I mentioned box sizing and the box model in my slides again. And that globally, you see this one that's called box. This is a new, or not a new, this is a CSS declaration called box sizing, and we could set that one to border box. And if you recall, there were quite a few border or box sizing models. So there was the standard box, and then the margin box, padding box. Border box tends to be the most popular. And if you just set it globally, which is what this star means, so every element on the page will have this style now that we have set it that way. And before I go on too far, I want to establish the reset. And what a reset is basically a way to go from every browser in your app or your website and just reset everything that comes with the browser, because the browser ships with some CSS on its own just to style things a certain way. You notice that even though this doesn't have any custom CSS tied to it, it's still a large heading and it's still bold and it's sans serif or a serif font. So things just have a default look because they need it. Otherwise, it would just look like plain text, not even broken in different lines, and just kind of be garbled. So that's what ships with a basic browser. So this might look different in Google Chrome or Firefox like I'm using, or Safari, whatever you're using. So that's just something to keep in mind. So a common pattern in that case is to use a reset file. And the reset is more or less just a way of setting everything in the file that's more or less the global reset to render a certain way and just kind of compensate for each thing that may be quirky between browsers. So what I want to do is actually go to a site called Normalize. I'll just Google Normalize CSS, and then it should pull that up. And it's just this version 11 download. You can install it all fancily, or you can just download it. It'll link to this file here. I'm going to just copy and paste all this stuff. And I'll include it in the actual file, the link to it. So if you want to download this style and this project and link to it, you totally can. So I'll link that. And inside here, there's comments for each thing, understanding why it's adding this style. It kind of explains things if you want to go through that. It more or less just resets everything. So if a margin is set to 0, there's no margin on these things by default. The same is true for like it's specific elements that come with some styles baked in every browser. So up here, I'll add a CSS comment. And this is how CSS comment works. So you'll have a /, a star, and then you can either continue that and close it. That's how you would close it. So it's all in here. It could be commented out. It won't render. It won't break anything. That's how that looks. I believe you can also do just a single inline comment. So while we're here, let me talk about commenting in CSS. This is how those traditionally look. So you'll see there at the beginning of the line, there's a forward slash and a star. And then at the end, it's a star and then the forward slash again. So it's just kind of this open and close effect. And that's how you can write some documentation in your CSS if you want to, or just kind of give a description of what's going on if you need to. It's up to you. I tend to not write too many comments because it actually does render in the browser if you don't remove it. So it's something that maybe some nasty people might want to take advantage of your site for whatever reason. That's kind of why I just do it that way. So I'll just link to this file directly. So if you download this, you can go ahead and just grab that URL and just paste everything in here, or whatever project you're creating with me if you're following along. Now, just like our styles.css file, we need to actually link to this file first. So let me do that first in line. So we'll say reset.css. Now, order matters here. So if you were to link to the reset and then have your styles come before it, those styles would apply and then the reset would apply. Even though in terms of specificity, it would work, and inheritance and this cascading thing we've talked about in the slides, things would work, but there might be some hiccups that you might notice. So doing the reset first is going to work wonders when you're writing custom styles coming up after that. And the browser is going to load top to bottom, so that's just one thing to keep in mind. So it's going to hit this first anyway, and then that one. So the reset's just going to go into the browser to make everything kind of normalize and then be good to go. So I'll actually add this to each page now that we've added it. All of our pages have that reset now. We've got our everything in here ready to roll. You notice not a huge amount changed. You might notice that if you just don't have any styles yet, but it's kind of just set up to be working and ready to go in this case. So let's roll with it. What I want to do first is go back to our CSS file and just define how you would actually use these variables we've already set. So typically in a CSS file, you're going to start targeting the global things first. So order doesn't terribly matter in terms of where you author your stuff in your CSS file. Just the cascading quality or how many times you author an element in a file does matter. So if you're not adding classes or IDs to things, you need to keep in mind that if you're repeating it, you will have to assume that the lowest style on the page on your file is going to be the one that actually renders, and it'll ignore the other files. So if you remember the example that we had, like a color red and then H1 color blue, you'll notice that this one's going to end up working to make everything blue as opposed to just red. So if we were to take this away, and you could comment this out by, in my code editor, I hit command /. You could probably do that in yours if you're on a Mac, but this red takes precedence in that way. So it's just kind of something to keep in mind if you're repeating yourself on those global things. Next, let's define the body element. And this is going to be selecting the body on each page we've linked to style sheet. So in this case, this element in our HTML and this element and all these files, since we're linking to this file in each. So with that in mind, what we can do is define some basic stuff that's going to set the stage for what our page looks like. So one that I always set up is font family. And this is how you can use your variable in CSS. You start with this var keyword and then pass that same name. So in our case, it'll be font, or excuse me, sans, can't speak. So we'll be using this variable since we set it globally. Now we could set this just inside here, like I said before, but that only gives us access to it within here instead of globally. So that's why this root thing exists. So continuing on, we can add another value pair and value. So font, not value, font size, excuse me, would be var font size. And we'll use another CSS selector called line height. Not selector, excuse me, it's just a property. And then background, we can just do something basic for now, and then I'll show you how we got that pattern, if you recall, in the demo. So background, by default, background is short for background color, background image, background whatever. You can be more explicit with CSS and say background color, and sometimes that matters. So if you don't have a image, or you want a specific image and a color, you can do it in two different declarations. So background image could be something here, but a neat time saver is to use just the background property, and then you can add additional elements in the same line. So there wouldn't be any commas or anything, but you could say the URL to the image in this case would pass into, I'm going to use one called topography, I think, .svg. So what this does is first sets the background color to the primary color we set here, and then it also assigns a background image, assuming we have got one in our files, which we don't yet, so this won't work, to this background image. And there's also additional properties to repeat that image, and you could say either no repeat or repeat just on horizontally, so you'd say repeat X, or vertically repeat Y. So it's up to you. You can add that even this way too, so no repeat, and it should work all the same. Now my code editor is smart enough to know that I'm typing these things, so it's going to give me this drop down to kind of assign it and just write it that way. I really recommend VS Code for something like that too. It's great for just knowing maybe almost ahead of time what you're going to type. It's just useful for speed. So let's actually grab this image before I go too further. This won't really, I think it'll render the color, but you notice we've got our font rendering the right way now, but not our image, which if you look in your browser, if you hit Command Option I or similar on a PC, you'll see, let's see, if we go to the inspect element of the page, I right clicked there, go to the body. I'm going to get this, and it's going to give me a say could not load image is the error it gives me. And this is a great way to kind of inspect your CSS in real time. Your browser gives these great dev tools to show you what's going on at any given moment, where styles are being applied to certain elements and whatnot. You'll even see the root element we defined. It's always present in the style sheet because we've made it a globally accessed thing. And then our resets at work here as well too. So that's cool to see. And you can actually do some debugging here. If you want the background color to not apply, you can actually toggle it on and off, which is useful. If you're trying to pinpoint why something isn't being styled or something's getting inherited a weird way, it's just really useful stuff. So I would recommend almost always keep your dev tools open if you can. Okay, so like I said, I'm going to grab that image. I'm using this site called Hero Patterns. It's by a designer called Steve Sugar. Basically, you can just go to this site and download these patterns, which are SVG images. And SVG is a scalable vector graphic, which means that it can scale to any size infinitely and still be sharp and no loss of resolution. So I actually just grabbed this pattern here. You could define some colors that are prefaced on this, but I just downloaded the unstyled one, so I'll do that again and save it. And we've got it here. I'll add it to the folder. Just drag it in on a Mac. And what I want to do first, I'll go back to my code editor to do this, but we need probably a great global place to keep images that we add in the project. So I'll actually make one called images. It's just a folder in that project. And in VS Code, you can drag and drop. So I'll drag that in there. And we'll be able to actually save at this point. And you'll notice in the background of our site, assuming you're using the live reload thing, you notice this new pattern now, which is great. It's a little sharp though, so what I want to do is go into the SVG and just modify it a touch. You can actually add some opacity to it with HTML, which is kind of like an inline style, but it's a little bit different because it's SVG based. So 0.2 is what I'm going to add, and it's going to just really set off that black contrast to be a little lighter as you render it. So that's something you could do. You could target that with CSS as well if you wanted to. You would have to actually embed that SVG into your HTML instead of linking it up like we have. But in this case, I think this works for us. So setting that foundation, we're basically ready to roll in terms of our body. We touched on quite a bit of stuff here. The background element is kind of one property that can be declarable. It can be used to declare many background attributes on the body itself. So we've got a color, we've got a URL. We can say if it's a repeatable pattern or non-repeatable pattern. So we could just say no repeat, and you'll just notice it's only this little square in this case. So that's kind of why I want it to repeat. It's meant to repeat. So the default in CSS when you declare a background image is to repeat. So you don't even need to set anything, which is useful. Okay, so we actually loaded a few weights. If you recall, when we added that font to our project, it's 400, 700, and 900. I want to go ahead and set all of our headings. So H1, H2, H3, H4. We could set it up to 6 in CSS. So HTML has that up to 6. And I don't think I'll use H5 or 6 in the project personally, but you might. But up to you if you want to cover those tracks. And I'll set the font weight property here to 900. And this goes up to a scale of basically from 100 to 900 on weight in the font. And that's just something you pick up as you go. It's all these different values and whatnot in the CSS kind of get confusing. And honestly, it just takes practice, overuse, and just kind of reusing it in other projects you're doing. You're just going to start to see how fast you can type CSS as opposed to referring to documentation or just knowing what even to pass to this font weight property. Oftentimes it'll take different units, so it doesn't really matter if you pass in something that's not maybe the norm, but it is something to kind of just see, maybe pick apart other people's code just to see what they're doing. You'll start to learn from that and go to town. Okay, so that's just kind of some global styles. That's just assuming we've got stuff taken care of, but already the site's looking tough to see. So what I want to do is kind of constrain this file to be more of a like container that's floating in the center. And what we can do is target that HTML in a certain way that makes sense for that to work. So what I want to add is a actual additional bit of HTML that's going to have a class of container. And I'm just inventing that word. It's just a way to say, hey, I'm going to contain this stuff. And I'm going to scroll all the way down to the very end and basically just pass the div right before the closing body tag. And a div is just a great way to break things up on HTML or just target it with CSS specifically. So what I'll do is just do that. And then our container can kind of have some basic styles that goes along with it. Maybe I'll add some comments for basic stuff here just to kind of give me an easy way to scan this file and find future stuff. So I'll just say containers and content. This is kind of just a pattern I like to follow. You can write CSS however you prefer. If you have your different way or different style you'd like to add these comments, for instance, you could do that. This is kind of a fancy way of doing so. But what I'll do is say container, which is that class name we just added. And we're going to set a max width on that. And max width essentially means go up until this width if you are going to span that far. It doesn't directly set a width, but it does cut off the width of that element, which is the full width of a browser by default. Since it's a block level element. Divs are block level elements. If you recall, that means they'll span the whole width of the browser. And then we have margin. And this is just mostly to kick things off the top and bottom of the browser window. And then this auto property, which essentially means make that width from the right and left automatic. And you'll notice that that makes this thing shift from the left and right automatically and just fixates itself in the center of the page, which is what we want. So if you notice, I'm doing the console dev tools here to just signify what this means. If I were to uncheck this, you'll notice it goes full width, which is the default value of a block level element. We just kind of hijack that with this max width property and then also the margin property to fixate it in the center. Now, the text itself is definitely hard to read, so let's make that a little easier to read. And we could set that up by using a background color property. And one cool thing here is there's a named color called white if you want to use it, or you can use the hex code like that, or if you want to use like RGBA, you can do 255, 255, comma separate these. And I'm going to use 1. 1 means full opacity. A here is called alpha, and these are red, green, blue. So we'll have the full spectrum there to get the white color. But if you were to maybe say 0.5 here, you'll notice it's opaque in the background. You can actually see through it. Doesn't look that great to me, so I'm going to go back to just the hex code value. There we go. So I did kind of overstep my boundaries of what margin's doing right here. So this is the top and bottom, and that's short for margin. By default can be margin left, margin right, margin top, and then margin bottom. If you write it shorthand like this essentially says, here, I'll just do it like this to show you. If you think of a clock, most clocks go clockwise. So if you think of that, you start at the top, you go to the right, you go to the bottom, and then you go to the left. So that's what this is. And in theory, it'll be top, bottom, or top, right, bottom, left in order. A shorthand for this is just to assume the top and bottom and left or right are going to be the same, is just to reduce these, and then it just becomes top and bottom. And this becomes left and right when you do it shorthand like this, because these are repeating on each side and the top and bottom. So hopefully that makes sense. When you have this shorthand, you can define it that way. You can define it in the same with padding. Padding is kind of the, if you remember the box model I showed you, the inside of the container or the contained content. We'll essentially set padding to none and kind of give this effect. And we'll kind of cushion this up in a second with another div we're going to pass to make this work. Okay, so we can actually add border radius as well. And that's going to be a 4-pixel border radius, so a absolute border radius. You notice the corners on that element get slightly rounded, which is nice. And then a really cool effect we can add is some shadow on the box itself, and notice it's called box shadow for that reason. So in this case, we can set the offset X to 0, the offset Y to 10 pixels, and then the blur radius to 10 pixels. And then we'll use the RGB value because I don't want to use a full color here. It would be a little too contrasted. So I'll just do a black color with very little opacity, probably even less than that. And you'll notice my code editor adds a 0 there. But this essentially says on the x-axis, don't add any shadow. On the y-axis, add 10 pixels. So it's going to put it below the box. And then the spread, or kind of the fuzziness of the shadow, is going to be 10 pixels as well. So if we go back to our browser and you look kind of at the bottom, if I go back and just kind of turn that off, you see a subtle shadow, which is all I want. I don't want to go too crazy there, but you can go to town there if you want to. Okay, so why don't we go back to our main top of the site and just work on this particular section and mention just for now to get some header going. And we don't actually have a header element in our HTML at this point. I could have added that in the HTML Crash Course, but I didn't think it was useful at the time because it's more a semantic thing than a, just a real element that makes a lot of sense at this point. So what I am going to do is add that now and remove this horizontal rule. And why we're going to add this is just a way to target this contain content. So I'm going to have our navigation in here, our what I'm calling our logo, and then our contact information as well. So I'll add a class of site header, and I'm going to add that thumbnail, if you recall, of some random person just to get this going. So I'll actually contain this content as well. So then we'll have this div containing this stuff, and then our nav on its own. That will be its own way to target with CSS. So we'll have our class, I'm going to call it header based content. And then inside that, I'm going to wrap it again because we need to target this specifically with CSS to kind of shift it around. So I'll say class header name. And I'm going to remove this contact information down here in another div called class header contact. Okay. And then I'll paste that line in there like so. So I want to divide these up because I want to add that image as well. So what I want to do is add that in front of or H1 there. So I just typed image and then hit tab. That's kind of just my code editor doing work for me, but we need a source, and we're going to say images jane.jpg, and we'll get that image in a second. The alt tag is going to be if the image doesn't load or someone's blind, for instance, they'll be able to still kind of know what this image might be. So maybe we could say portrait of Jane Smith. Something like that. I wouldn't skip this either. You kind of get penalized on your website for not having those attributes from search engines and whatnot. So I'll just say class thumbnail. I'm just getting our HTML in order here so we can go to town on our CSS, and then class page title. We'll be reusing this on each page. And I'll go down the line here and add the necessary class to header navigation so we can target that. Now I could just technically target the nav element, but I don't really know. At least when I'm coding websites, there might become times where I use the nav element somewhere else. You don't just want to target those globally that way. You'll run into issues with conflicting styles. So if you can target it directly like this, you have that specific thing you can target in a way that makes sense. And you might notice that I don't use very many IDs to target elements. IDs are kind of a one-trick pony. So when you use it once, you can only have one specific ID that's unique on a web page. You can't repeat it in HTML. So with CSS, it makes sense to maybe use it that way if you're targeting something very specific or unique. But in theory, most of the time I would reach for class names if I were you. That's just kind of a pro tip. So let's assume that's enough for now. We'll go back to maybe add this stuff to our other pages. So I'll copy this over. I'm going to make sure it's actually correct. Base content, header name. We want to link to the actual home page here too. So let's do that real quick. A way you could do that in HTML is just actually wrap it with an anchor tag. So the A, closing A, will come and be right there, and then we'll link directly to index.html, which is this page, but on other pages that will make a lot more sense. So if you ever want to go back to the start, you totally could. And that's just going to link to the image, not the H1 actually. So I think that's good to go. One thing I want to add real quick is a span tag here. And what this is going to do is just give us a way to kind of define a common divider class. I want this to be a little less like opacity than this text and just be out of the way of those things. So that's a way to kind of target that and deal with it. A span tag is going to be an inline element, so inline block, or just basically won't break a new line, which is the point. So that's just kind of what we're doing there. And we'll use the same one here as well. So class divider. Okay. Now, what I want to do, I think that sums up the navigation. So our header, unfortunately, we need to copy this code a few times on each of these pages. So I'll just kind of do that wherever the content ends. So the same here. We'll need to update a little bit of stuff on the navigation because these are different pages, but we'll get to that. So I think the last one. Okay. On the contact and other pages, I think I excluded the contact area, so I'm going to remove that. And we just are left with this. The same with the blog. You don't need to do this, but it might be, in your opinion, a good thing to do. Just less stuff on the page. Distractions, you know. Contact might make sense to keep it, but I'm not sure there. Yeah, let's leave it there for contact. So since we're on contact, I'll just add, I'm going to command click on my code editor and just go to index.html here. If that links up to that home page and then our skills section, since that's all, if you recall from the HTML Crash Course, there's embedded content that we link to an ID on that page and allows you to jump to that specific part of a page as opposed to a new page. Again, go check out that Crash Course if you're not sure what that means. And then I'll do the same on, we don't need to do it on index, but our other blog pages we do, so I'll do that real quick. Okay, and that should be good. So with that, I will start focusing in on our CSS. This won't change anything for the look and feel, but it does give us, if you look and inspect element, now we've got this header class, we've got this other class we can target directly, and then other header name and header contact. Allows us to shift things around with CSS and kind of get things rolling in that way. One thing I don't have, if you notice, I did add that alt tag. It renders when the image tag doesn't render. That's kind of a built-in feature of HTML. If it doesn't know that that image or where it's at, it's going to go ahead and render the alt tag in line as opposed to it, which is a great quality of life thing that comes with browsers by default. What I'm going to use for that resource is a site I found. It's called This Person Does Not Exist. And basically, these are AI rendered people. And I'm just going to find a female here. And basically, they just literally aren't people. They're just there rendered via AI. So it's wild and it's crazy accurate. So we're going to call her Jane and just go from there. Now this image is probably going to be huge, so you might want to actually, a good pattern to do is to either resize it dramatically or optimize it. I like to use an optimized tool called Image Optim, and I keep it in my doc here. You can download this. I think it's just a Mac app, but you might find something similar for a PC. But you literally drag it and drop it in there. It kind of does its optimizations, and then you're ready to roll. I think we just saved about 300K. I could be wrong there, but I'm going to resize this just a tad to be maybe a 400 by 400 picture. We'll save that down, and now it's something a little more usable for our app, and we can size it with CSS accordingly. All right, so I'll add that link to the code real quick, just so you know where that's at. Maybe right by the image. This is HTML comment. I can add that way, and we could just say sourced via CSS this person does not exist.com, and save that down. So now we have access to that. image. This could be different for yours, and I'm sure it will be actually because it's dynamic. So every time we render that page, it might have its own use and look and feel. Okay, so what I want to do is really focus in on this header, and ways we can do that kind of makes sense. Like we grouped it containers in this case like that. I'm going to do the same for the header element, just so if you're working with someone else or scanning this file, they're going to make it easier to find. CSS files tend to get pretty long, so the more you add, the actually longer it's going to take to load on the page. So you want to be considerate of that. But modern browsers and our fancy computers we have today are pretty performance ridden, so they're great for doing stuff like that and being okay to render stuff. So in this case, I'm going to add a gradient, and we can use a background like we did before, just using a single color, but we can apply multiple colors using this thing called linear gradient that allows you to go from kind of a blend from one color to the next. It's kind of a neat effect to give you more dynamic color in your website. So if a browser is older and doesn't understand it, this declaration we're about to write, you can actually just still apply a color, and in this case I'm going to, and it'll apply that instead. Just if it sees that it doesn't know how to apply the gradient itself, it'll render this color instead. And we talked about that in as a feature. That's part of the way CSS works, or HTML for that matter. If there's something new in the browser doesn't understand, and it's actually just going to skip it and move on instead of actually error out or make your computer crash. So in this case, we'll say background linear gradient. There are different types of gradients, so we'll just stick with the main linear. And what you can say is to top, and what I'll say is 4143 345, and then 232. 232 526, and the numbers here coincide. So this is the first color, and this is the second color. So we're kind of going from the bottom to the top, and the bottom's going to have this lighter color, and the top's going to have the darker color. So you can go crazy with this. I would look up, gradients are kind of tough with CSS, so I would look up, maybe just Google it if you need help finding the syntax or a certain pattern you want to employ. I do that all the time still when I write CSS every day, so don't feel bad if you don't know it by heart. One thing though, some browsers again need fallbacks, and this is a way to consider that. WebKit is a way, or a browser rendering engine. Basically Google Chrome, Safari, and I think Microsoft Edge now use the WebKit rendering. Firefox is kind of the outlier, but the way you can target those browsers specifically is using this -WebKit. If it were Firefox, you might do Firefox. I think it's Firefox like that, or Mozilla, Moz, I think is the actual name, because it's named by that company. So that's just something to understand. It's not important to have, but just know when you declare something like this with these dashes at the beginning, it's only going to apply to certain browsers and not all of them. So you need to think about how you can apply something to all browsers just to have that basic support for no matter who comes to your website. So we'll just basically declare the same stuff and pass it through just for ultimate support. And we get rid of those. Now that sets up the background. You notice if I go back to there, you notice the slight gradient. So it goes to the top, and it's going to use that darker color at the top. Just based on the patterns we passed here, you could say to bottom if you want. Or right or left, whatever you want to do. So notice it's a little different. I'm going to do to top because that's how I did the demo. Okay, so with that, continuing on, we'll set the color to white, so all the text in this case will turn white, and just reset the margin to be nothing in case there is any. And padding will give each side. So again, if you recall, it's top, right, bottom, and left. The clockwise version of setting that is basically saying, let's just make each of those 10 pixels. This is a shorthand way of saying that. You could set those all this way as well. But you can see how many times you have to type that and how tedious that gets. Just if you can get used to these shorthands, it makes your life a little bit easier as you're writing CSS. And then we'll get into positioning coming up. Relativeness basically means everything within this site header class is going to be positioned to it. So instead of it being like the full spectrum of the website, if you set this box to a relative, notice it's a box. Anything in here that's positioned a different way will kind of be relative to it, so it won't float outside of this box. Okay, so with CSS, you can chain things. So site header, and for instance, I want to target all the anchor tags or the A tags in the site header itself. So there's quite a few. We've got all of these. These are all A tags as well as these. And I want those to be white. So we can set that explicitly. So you can, again, we can write white here and just do the hex code value. I just tend to kind of lean towards the hex code. It's always 6 numbers. If there's a newer kind of version of hex that allows you to add some opacity as well, that gives you that opaqueness that you might have remembered from RGBA. We won't go too deep there, but that's just a new kind of tech coming into the scene that allows you to do that. But that changes all of our links to white, as you can see. So time we need to declare something unique in that site header. So in our case, the hover effect. This is one of those pseudo selectors that allows you to target to kind of the interaction of that link. So in our case, we'll say text decoration, which is another property, and we'll just say none. So right now, default link is going to have the underline, and that's just kind of the way it works. And you need to spell things correctly so this will work. So now when we hover over it, notice the hover, this effect happens. So you can go wild with this, but I think keeping it simple is pretty easy and useful. Now there's one called visited as well, and there's quite a few actually, but we'll say visited, and I'll just show this one by example. We won't run with it, but maybe you visited a link before. You can actually tell that user if they've been on their site for a little while that they've gone here before, depending on what they're looking at. It's kind of useful for them if they've already seen something, or maybe they clicked on a link before. So maybe I'll go to contact and then I'll go back. And let's double check that I typed that right. Yep, I need to spell things correctly first. So then everything's been visited at this point. So just based on my browser history, this is how that's pulling up. But if you were never to click on a link before, it's going to tell you, you haven't visited that yet. So now we can target that thumbnail, and we can just keep using the site header class to kind of be specific to that header element. We could just say, oh, I just want to target this class, but you might have this class somewhere else in your project. So it's kind of useful, or at least considered a good practice, to kind of be somewhat selective in that case. So here we're always going to narrow in our search using the site header class and then target the things within it, because you never know, as your project grows, you're going to find you're going to have conflicting things, and that's just kind of a fail-safe. So site header, and then I'll say thumbnail, and this is styling an image. So what I'll say is max width. We just want to set that width to only be 64 pixels total, and we can scale that down with CSS, and it just kind of proportionally aligns itself there. Thing to add here is height auto. And that basically says the height's going to be dynamic based on whatever the width is. So we'll just go ahead and set that automatically to compensate. So instead of setting a strict height, you could say like 32. But you notice the image is going to be kind of wonky. And that's only if you really set a hard width. So that's how it gets stretched and skewed. Max width basically is a nice way to circumvent that. But your hard height's going to take over because it's a lower pixel. So we have a border radius here. We can set that pretty large. So I often use 100% to make a full circle. I've seen other developers use 999 pixels just to kind of have an actual hard width. Basically means a full circle, but it's up to you what you want to use there. Percent based thing is just another unit of measurement. We talked about that in the slides as well. Totally possible to use either. And then border, you'll use this one often. So the first value here, like the background color before, remember we could set things in multiple ways in one line as opposed to just being explicit, like background repeat, background color, background image. You do the same with border. You can do it pretty much any CSS property. Actually, they have shorthands. So in this case, I want to set a border that's going to be 3 pixels in width, and it's going to be a solid border. There's a lot of different styles of borders you can have, like a dashed or dotted. It's up to you. I would read the CSS documentation, maybe on MDN or something, to get that real spectrum. And then we could say 0.5 or 0.8 maybe of a border that's slightly opaque. And then we will position that. Since we're going mobile first here, I'm going to show you what that means in a second, but I want to get some styles in order first. Let's see what that looks like. So now we got this look and feel. And then finally on like hover, I kind of wanted to do something fancy. So maybe I'll do that first and come back here and show you an additional thing we need to add. So site header, we can do a similar pattern. So thumbnail with the pseudo selector like we did on the links. So you can add it to classes or elements as well. So we could set on hover, we can set a thing called cursor. It allows you to change the cursor of your mouse. So in this case, we want a pointer. And then the border color, we can set explicitly. Again, this is shorthand. I set that color here without passing border color. We can set it explicitly with this CSS declaration there. So in our case, I'm going to actually use our secondary color. So I can say secondary color, which, if you recall, we set right here. And then some nice kind of effects with CSS we can get that are a little more advanced, but I'll cover them just so you can see the power of it. One's called transition, and it allows you to target how a certain element kind of moves or on an interaction. So you'll see what that means in a second. So here I'm defining some properties for that, basically saying on the transform method, which we're going to define here. I'll do that now. So transform, we're going to scale the thing so the image will go up slightly in width and height, and then we'll rotate it ever so slightly. So rotate -5 degrees. Again, this is more advanced stuff. You can get into this as you get more familiar with CSS, but I just wanted to show you the power. So in our transition, you're basically saying ease into this movement you're doing here. So we pass transform because that's what's changing. This is the thing that's changing. We want this to really just transform easily using this like slower version of movement. And to get that full effect, we actually need to apply the same thing up here. It's kind of a quirk of transitions. You need to apply it to the static version and also the version on hover, in this case, to get that real like smooth feel. So I'll show you what that does now. So as we hover over it, we're able to do this kind of effect. The border changes, you notice the size scales, and the whole thing rotates slightly. So if we were to remove the transition, for instance, you'll see how rigid it looks. So I'll just comment those out. It just does that, which works, and it does what we're wanting, but it's kind of, you know, not smooth. So this transition property helps a lot with that. Okay. So continuing on, we've got our hover effect, we've got our transition effect. Let's add some basic styles for the header-based content. If I can spell right. So we'll display block. And then margin bottom, we can just be explicit with that margin. We can write it shorthand too, like we did before. You would say margin, maybe top would be 0, right 0, bottom 20 pixels, left 20 pixels. That's another way to write that. I prefer that if it's only a single element or single unit you're going to actually target. And that allows you to just kind of push things down underneath this header-based content that we called it. And then we'll get into what will be some Flexbox stuff. Flexbox is a newer way to kind of adjust layouts in CSS, that in CSS Grid, which we'll kind of tackle a little bit in this course. Not a lot, because those are worth their own course, but there's a lot to CSS if you couldn't tell. I forgot one selector. I'm going down the list here. And I'm writing this with notes, so keep in mind, writing CSS is usually a lot of back and forth. You're usually in your browser checking to see things, then you're going back to your editor. It takes time, so just keep that in mind, that this is more or less me trying to conserve your time as I'm authoring this course, as opposed to just being like a real life experience. Maybe I'll do something like that soon though, where I stream it or something that allows you to kind of see the actual patterns of writing this stuff in real time. But I got our header name here, and we don't have anything displayed flex yet, so this property really doesn't matter at the moment, but you'll notice soon when it does. So the header content is going to be a font size of smaller, so we'll use our font size small, and continue down the selectors we added. So I want the P tag in there to be no margin and display block. And then let's see how that looks. It's basically just getting some things dialed in, nothing too crazy yet. And then we'll do a site header of divider. That divider class we added allows us to kind of give that a different color now that we are. So I'll just kind of set a white color but opaque. And padding will be top and bottom will be 0, left and right will be just 2 pixels, just to give it some offset. So now I've got those slight little dividers there looking pretty good. Okay, and finally we've got a page title class. I might make that more of a global thing, because I'm going to add that on all the pages basically. So the font size will be 32 pixels, and line height, we can set that. That's kind of the up and down baseline of the font. To kind of reset it to 1, just so it's consistent. So we'll say margin bottom 20 pixels, and then margin top 10 pixels. So that makes each of these just kind of have their own styles. So this has that page title class, I believe. Yep. And that's our styles there now. So if we tweak those slightly, you'll see the difference. Now let's work on that navigation. It's at this point works, but it looks pretty, it's taking up a lot of space. I kind of want it to be like inline, and this top black box to be a lot shorter in height. And this is all mobile first, mind you. So this is stuff you're going to see primarily in this view. One thing I did fail to do is add a meta tag property to make this a mobile first resolution. So let's do that real quick before I forget. And what that basically means is the scaling on the site, when you're adding it to your HTML, it's going to just use this as the basis. It's not going to assume it's made for mobile versions of mobile devices. So what we can add is this meta tag, and it says viewport is the name. And then the content's going to do kind of a wonky thing, but we'll say the width is going to equal to the device width. So whatever device loads this page, we're going to set the width of the site to it by default. And then you could say the initial scale is going to be 1.0. So just kind of a standardized way to load the site. So let's copy this to all pages. Sorry, I missed that bit. And this can go anywhere in the head tags. I'm just adding it, I think, below each title tag. Contacts got it, index has it. Okay, great. So now, if I were to actually go to the mobile view, you notice it shrinks up, and that's the whole point. So that meta tag is pretty crucial to having a responsive website, which is basically the norm these days. If you don't have one of those, you kind of get penalized by search engines, or it's just hard for people to be able to use your website, because most people, if you recall or you see them going down the road or something, have a phone on them, and this is how they're browsing the websites these days. So it's important to think about that as you're coding. Okay, so sorry for that aside. I just forgot about that. Let's go and continue on our navigation. So our header navigation, now I could go ahead and write site header, just continue going to that way, but I feel like this is more explicit enough so that we can just target it via the class and it will be okay. It's up to you how specific you want to be with your selectors. The more specific you are, the harder it is, I think, as this website grows, because you might need to reuse some styles elsewhere, and that's what classes are for. They're kind of a reusable way to reuse styles and whatnot in your app or website. So what I'll target is this unordered list we've added, and it's basically this thing right here. I'll grab it. It's OL, and it has some default styles which basically include the numbers as it grows. So we want to get rid of that, and also just have some styles that go along with it that look more streamlined, more modern. So a way to get rid of those numbers is to set the list style to none. You'll see them disappear. We will also set the padding to 0. And it comes with some baked in, so that shifts it back over. And then let's go back to the margin and set that 10 pixels on the top. On the left and right, we'll set 10 pixels in negative. You can set those in negative format, which you'll see why in a second. And then the background color, be explicit with that. We'll set it to our dark color. So like slightly offset of what our normal menu is. And this is the mobile first view, so I'll just do that in this view to start. Okay, so the navigation anchor tags I want to add next. So navigation A, with those we can just add some padding top and bottom of 10 pixels, left and right of 16 pixels. Margin will be 0 all around. The display will be block on mobile, or in this case, this responsive format. So we want it to look like this on the phone. If it's larger, which we'll get to, it'll be displayed inline. So like I said, mobile first is what I'm going to approach this as. And then we could say text decoration none for these links. We don't want those underlines at all on mobile. Okay, so that's starting to look pretty good. And then this is more applicable to the desktop view once we go to that route, but we're going to just change the color on hover to be our secondary color, which is that green. And the color of the text will be white once we hover over it. And then we can again do that transition thing to give it some subtleties when it does these hover effects. So background color, we'll target that to be the one thing that moves or transitions in this way. We'll use a timing event there. We can also target more than one. So in our case, we could say color as well. So the color and the background color in this case will transition in a specific way. Now in the previous way we used transition, we passed this ease property. That's the default. You don't need to use it, but you can pass it here if you want to, like ease in out is another way to write it. If you don't write anything, it just assumes ease. So this won't matter on mobile because you can't really hover on mobile, but if we go to our desktop view, you see that effect take place. So this is shaping up. That takes care of the navigation on the mobile view. Why don't we target it on the desktop view to get that looking good so we can kind of get that holistically set up and finished. And then we'll move on to the main content of each page. So I want to talk about media queries real quick. Media queries are these @media symbols that allow you to basically define CSS based on a set of width or height constraints. You can also target it via what type of device the CSS is being used on. So in most cases, it's going to be a screen device. You could use a projector as well and target things that way. Sometimes TVs you can target with CSS a certain way. So there's all these properties built into the media query. I really recommend reading up on if you're interested in that. You'll see, I think what you're going to see here being the most common. This is how you would write the media query though. So let me get into that. Now, this is how a mobile first media query is typically written. You can do max width here or min width. You can use height as well if you have a certain height thing you want to target. The idea here is more or less to write just enough CSS instead of ever thinking of absolutely every width on the planet. So there's so many devices out there. The width is going to vary, obviously. So you can't target them all. If you tried, you would be writing CSS the rest of your life, probably. But what you can do is kind of give a general consensus based on a certain width that's most common. And in this case, it's, in at least the case I've seen, 767 is I guess it's a small tablet width, which is kind of, at this width, we'll be able to do different things based on when that screen hits that width or not. So depending on what you load the web page on, you're going to have different CSS being applied with this rule set. And what you do is basically just author CSS the same way, but it needs to be contained within this block. So hopefully that makes sense. So this is going to be basically what's on our desktop view. So anything 767 pixels and above will be using this code. So when I say mobile first, all of this code is designed at this point to be used for this kind of view. So something on a mobile device or a smaller width unit. It still applies to the desktop view because it inherits, but you can target stuff a little bit differently, whether it's the size of something or the width of something, and move down the page a certain way. So what I first want to do is, since we define our container class, I'm going to do that and do a little bit different on the desktop view. So it's a little more offset. So let's go and toggle that back. You'll see it back here. I needed to write auto here. There we go. So now there's more on the desktop. It's more space in between the top and bottom. But on mobile, you notice it changes down to that 40 pixel we were using before. And you can see it in your browser, or 24, excuse me. When we go to a certain width, let me try to do this right here. Usually you can, yeah, there we go. Watch my browser as I get to a certain width. Here's that media query being applied. And then there it is getting taken away. So as you can see, a certain width, it targets that CSS and responds accordingly, which is very nice when you need to target and design for as many devices as we have in the world today, which is massive. Okay, I'm going to borrow the comment code from here and go back down to here. And it's going to feel like you're repeating code, but you're basically just targeting a different device. And the idea here is to be as minimal as possible, right? As least amount of CSS as you can. So we've established, I guess, the general look and feel from the mobile first approach, but we want to take it further and just kind of give it a different look on the desktop. So it looks a little more, realistic, and maybe it takes up less vertical space in this case. So here's where the real design, I would say, comes into play for this design. So it might vary for yours. So we're going to target the site header to be a little bit different with padding on the top 30 pixels, the right 30 pixels, the bottom will have none, the left will have 30 pixels, and then we'll set margin bottom to none. So you notice that jump in a lot on the desktop view. It's a lot more padding on the inside of that header. And then we can do the flex property. We remember that we set that flex 1 property that made no sense in the context of that element. But what we can do now, it should make sense when we display flex. And flex box is the new, like I said, pattern to kind of adjust layouts that's more flexible in the browser. It allows you to kind of just set columns and widths in dynamic ways that just float in the browser a certain way and make it just a lot easier to move things around. Oh, I need to type right. Site header. There we go. Now we got this stuff flexed. You notice it shifted to the right. And that's by design. That's kind of what I wanted. So more on that in a second. We'll keep going. Site header and then thumbnail. This is going to be a pretty gnarly thumbnail. It's going to use some tricks I like to use to position things in the center of an element, but also position it like offset, like outside of the container of a box, so the box model itself. And absolute is the position. And let me just add these styles and I'll talk you through it. And it's going to look funky, I know. So negative 64 pixels divided by 2. You can do math in CSS. Left is 50%. And then margin left is calc. Negative 64 pix divided by 2. Okay, so what's going on here? If you recall, way up here on our site header, we set the position to relative. And what that means is anything within that container or that header is going to be relative to this box, not the whole site. Like if you didn't define that, watch, if I take that off, I'll try to show you by example. That's going to go to the very top of the browser, and that's because the most relative parent element in a website is the body element right here. So it's going to be relative to that, and in fact it'd probably be the HTML element because that's the highest one in the chain. So when you set something to relative, it allows you to kind of contain that thing, assuming you set something else to absolute or whatever in that. Now there's a position fixed that ignores both of those things, and fixed just means it's going to stay in that exact spot on that page no matter what. I don't think I have anything fixed in this design, but it is something to keep in mind. Positioning is a pretty tough concept to understand. It's going to take practice to get used to, but I promise over time you'll get there. It was probably the hardest thing for me to understand when I was learning. So don't worry if that isn't quite clear. But what's happening here, with positioning, you can set top and left and right and bottom CSS attributes. And a neat thing is newer to CSS is called calc, which means calculate, which basically means do some math for me. And what you can do in this case, I've measured, if you recall, the thumbnail, we've set a max width of 64. So that's where that number comes from. When I do that calculation, I want it to be divisible by 2 because I want it to be half of the width and height of that element, just kind of overcasting this box. So you can see it's almost neck and neck in the center if you go across and were to cut that in half. And additionally, if I set left to 0, it's going to just be left to 0 on this box. But if I do 50%, it'll shoot across. And it looks completely centered right now, which is the point. And that's what's happening here. If I didn't set this margin left to a negative value, it's going to look a little off. It's going to be a little further to the right. So if I set that up and do this calculation, I already know, okay, 64 divided by 2 is 32. But if you have a number you're not sure about, this is very useful to use, and I think it's just more of a fail-safe thing. So in this case, it's going to be negative 32. The top is negative 32, which is half of 64. And then we'll just be able to hit left 50%, which is always going to be half the width of a box in the scope of this box model. So it's a lot to throw at you, but that's kind of what's going on there. It's fancy, but it does the job and works pretty well. Now the cool thing is we set this up on the desktop view, so for you to go to mobile, it's going to actually ignore that because we don't have that set up on mobile. On mobile, if you recall, we just set it to block. So if I go up here, position static, excuse me. So when you say static, it ignores that position absolute because that hierarchy in the chain, the way this media screen works, it goes ahead and ignores the absolute property altogether. And you don't even have to worry about these because if it's static, this stuff gets ignored completely. And then I believe we set margin to 0 to compensate for that margin left as well. So you're basically overriding yourself when you set these things up in a responsive way. That's that cascading effect coming into play a lot. Okay, so continuing on, we've got the site header. You notice the way I like to type CSS, I like a space between everything. And then I like each line to have its own line. Up to you if you want to do that. This is totally valid if you want to write it this way. I find that hard to read, but I've seen it done, so it's up to you. My editor even, corrects me if I'm wrong in that formatting, so you might just follow suit if you're using one that's already doing that for you. So margin left will be 10 pixels here. We'll display inline block. And then if you remember, we added the page title on mobile. I'll do that here as kind of a global, and we'll set that font size to be larger on desktop screens. So now it's a lot bigger once we go this way. Notice how big it is now. So pretty cool. And these are all online because we displayed inline block on that P tag. So there's quite a few P tags in this div that allow us to do that. And then the header navigation OL we'll do a little bit differently and increase the line height. We can say 1.75. This is essentially just going up the chain, no matter how. I think you can go up to 10. I'm not sure, probably even more, but this increases it from the normal. And then we could say margin 0, -30, and then display flex. So that gives us this look and feel. And I'll show you, I'll do an inspect element on that. Here's the styles being applied. If we weren't flexing it, we're going to get this block level look, which is what we have on mobile. And that's actually being overridden when we hit the mobile screen. So if we were to go down, if you push your browser to a certain width, it just goes and jumps to that automatically, which is the power of media queries. And then our negative margin, since we have padding on here that's about 30 pixels, we can actually set a negative margin that makes it butts up to the edge, which gives it a nice look. And then we've got our hover class as well. So that's working great. Awesome. So I believe that wraps up the header. Let's get going on the main content of the pages. I want to add some more HTML to get that intact. And then we'll go to town. Maybe I can confirm that the other pages look okay. I don't think I have the container in the other pages. So let me add that real quick on there. We'll go all the way down. Save that on each of these. I use a plugin called Emmet that allows you to type in this kind of shorthand way and then hit tab and it'll kind of create markup on the fly. If you're seeing me do that fast, that's what it is. I really recommend it. Makes your life a lot easier if you're writing a lot of HTML like I do. I get used to a bunch of key commands too, so more practice, you'll get there if you're brand new to this. Okay. I think that should do it. Let's double check. If I go to contact, our page is, looking good now. If we go to a blog post, we've got stuff rendering here, but it's not. We'll have to update some of this stuff. Okay, so let's focus on this content here in particular. I'm going to basically focus on the resume portion next, and we'll be able to target a lot of that kind of globally, but some of it will be specific to the elements on that page. So what I'll do is go back down to our container area that we added. I'll start with mobile first again and add a class called content. This will just be basic padding of 10 pixels. And we'll need to add that class still to our page. So it's going to wrap everything below header. So right before our footer element, I'm actually going to get rid of these BR and HR tags. We'll be able to target CSS and create that space more easily. And while I'm at it, why don't we kind of break up each section to have its own block. So we can target each section kind of to have its own like maybe margin and padding. So in this case, I will say resume block. And just pass the div that wraps that content, and then we'll repeat ourselves here That's ends right there. Same here. After that, and then I think I added one called index blog. Yeah, and then our container class on the home page, I actually want to break up to be 2 container classes because I want the blog to live kind of on its own little island or its own box. So this is ending that container class way up here, and then we're starting a new one right here for the blog. So we'll wrap the blog with that, and it'll just end up being where we took that last one out. Finally, we will add inside this container, we'll have index blog and a content class to give that padding we added just now. And we'll wrap that table. And I'm actually going to get rid of tables in this section because we want to be a little more modern with that approach. Tables are great for data, but rendering just basic blog posts aren't really necessary. Get rid of these footer elements too. And this inline styling I forgot. We'll get rid of that. And this table. And make sure that's spelled right. So we got our article elements. I still want to wrap these with a div though, because we're going to use some CSS grid. You might have heard that. That's kind of the latest breakthrough of CSS to style these and kind of align them in a certain way that makes sense. And I'm just going to add the remaining classes I'm going to need. So I'm going to say excerpt on each of these p tags. Now there's a ton of ways to write CSS, so my way isn't the only way. I want you to just take that, how I'm doing what I'm doing, is with a grain of salt. More of it's just like foundational. I want you to get exposed to this stuff so you can understand it more, so you can get to where you could choose the way you want to write it and understand why you would want to write it that way. Today I use more of a framework-based approach that's very reusable, pattern-driven styles, to where I don't even really have to write a ton of this style of CSS. It's already pre-baked into a framework, but that's a topic for another time. Okay, I think we're set up. We'll find out if not. There's one final class I want to add to our footer element here and just say site footer. And I might need to just add that to each page. And I'll wrap this one in that content. Okay, and same is true for pretty much all these. So I'll just say content. So if we go to each page now, we should see everything kind of working in our favor, I think. Pretty close. We'll get to the desktop styles coming up. I think it's more or less a mobile first approach right now. So we've got our actual look and feel going on. I'll just zero out of that for now. Let's go back to our CSS now. We've got our main content tag with some basic styling. This will be for the mobile version, so we'll target that directly. And let's add some basically more global CSS that's going to target more things on the whole global scale of the website. So in this case, on our blog, we'll have a block quote, and that's going to be an actual HTML element we could style directly. So we'll say font size is going to be font size large. Font family, we'll do the serif font family for this. Give it some different looks and feel. You can set a different style on fonts. So this, as you notice, I'm doing font dash. This could all be applied just like we did the background image and whatnot earlier. So you could just set font and just apply all these things. I find this one, at least in my case, more legible to write these more explicit. Up to you if you want to do that differently. And then margin, top and bottom will be 20 pixels. Padding will be 0, 0, 0. We could just say padding left. 24 pixels. And border left, 2 pixels solid, and then we'll say var gray dark. So if we go to a blog post, which isn't what I was actually going to work on, but if we go to one, you notice that style comes through accordingly, which is great. Now it might need to be tweaked on mobile, like that's pretty large, but that's okay for now. But again, these are just global things at this point. So along with block quote, I'm going to add image tag. It's just going to assume all images are going to have these styles on our site. So max width will be 100%. We'll set height to auto, kind of like that thumbnail we did. Just kind of setting the width and height to be just the max they can be. So on our blog, for instance, that's going to pay most dividends. So it's the full width of this container at this point. So if I were to go and inspect that element of that and remove width with 100, it wouldn't scale. So this kind of just makes that all consistent across each blog post, assuming there's an image. Finally, on some blog posts, I had a figure and figure caption, which is kind of like an image, just more details of the image is in text. So it's got an actual caption underneath. So we could say text align, which allows you to shift text to the center of the screen. You could put left or right here as well. Font size will be small. Color, we'll use our variable of gray, medium. And font style again, italic. Margin top, 10 pixels. So just slightly different. So one of these, forget which one to be honest, I think it might be this one, has a caption somewhere. There it is. So I just designed it a certain way. Just that's that fig caption. We've made the text centered. It's slightly gray. It's italicized as well. Okay, and then a pre-tag is kind of a way to embed actual code into your HTML. So you can, for web developers in particular, this is a way to show code snippets or examples in maybe a blog post or something, or documentation. This is kind of the de facto way of doing that with HTML and CSS. So commonly it's a great way to style a bit differently, so you can get that shift in contrast, so you know what's code and what's actually content on the page. So it's up to you how it looks. I went for a darker background look and feel for that. So var gray dark, color white. So there's one page where I have code like this. You might come across a site that has like these colorized. That's some JavaScript doing that stuff. So you need a third-party library as well as some additional CSS to target certain elements in the text. So it's not something that's native to the browser you can reach for, but you can go as far as what I have here to style a code snippet in a certain way. So that's something I wanted to keep in mind. All right, so with those base styles added, we can continue on to the resume content. So let's do that now. Our media query here. So let's leave that alone. I just want to reuse these comments. And we'll do that. We'll just say resume, mobile, first views. Okay. And this is where we're going to get into the homepage resume. So resume block, I added that for each section, and it's just going to have some margin. I just want some bottom margin on that, so it pushes off the next block in line. A neat thing with CSS is you can target individual blocks with these pseudo classes. So one's called first of type, and you can also target one last of type, so the last one in the chain. Now it needs to have the same class. They all need to, have the same class to be able to do this. So we'll say first of type, and it'll only target the first resume block class in our stuff, our code. So margin top will be 40 pixels in this case. It gives it some offset on the very top on the home page. We'll go back to the home page by clicking on our thumbnail there. But you notice each one has some offset. The first one will have more on the top, and that'll be more easy to see once we get more styling going on. So let's do each H2. Each resume block has an H2 or H heading, and I'll make these kind of fancy. I like the look of kind of a all caps font to just show the different section itself. You can actually modify the capitalization of text, either saying like capitalize, or in my case I'm going to do uppercase, which means make everything uppercase. And then we'll do our color, primary color. Font weight will be 600. Letter spacing, it allows you to kind of control the width between the text itself. I'm going to use M's here because it's more of a relative unit of measure. Margin top will be 20 pixels, margin bottom 16 pixels. Line height, we'll keep it at 1 just to keep it normal. You could say normal as well, I believe, but I'll just leave it at 1. Padding is bottom will be 5 pixels, just slight, and then border bottom, let's say 1 pixel. Solid var, we'll use the gray color. Light. Okay, so each H2 is going to have this look and feel now, which is kind of neat. Kind of bolder, but still signifies the division of each section. And then we have an H3, which is these style of headings. We can target those too. So I'm not going to repeat the styles, but just to get some stuff there, we'll have a font size of basic font size, font style, italic. Let's just get rid of the rest here. And font weight, we'll get it slightly bold, but not all the way. Again, that goes up to 900 so far, and it's in 100 increments, so you can't do like 520 or anything. Yeah, you could with a certain font, but not the one that we're using. Color and line height. So you could say normal, like I said. Margin 0. So that gives us that look and feel now that we have it. A way to target both unordered lists and ordered lists. So assuming we have those in our content or HTML, we can target them combined like this. So you just comma separate the selector, and you're able to write the same styles for each. That ends up getting duplicated by the browser, but it allows us to write it once and be done. So it's nice. So we'll say padding left 16 pixels and margin bottom is 24 pixels. So all of our lists are going to just render a certain way now, which are mainly these. I just set some padding there. And then resume block table. Tables are kind of their own bear. They're not really great for responsive design. They are great for displaying data. So take it as it comes. But if you're going to look for a very mobile ready website, I would kind of defer away from tables if you can. You can make it scrollable on mobile, like using your thumb, but it's still not that usable in some cases. So you might find less and less use of tables out there, unless it's in an email, which is a whole nother topic. So text align left. So that'll just kind of give our table a full width boundary here, and we're aligning everything left instead of centered like it was by default. So resume block table, there's a caption element, and let's just set that kind of to be less in the way. I'm using a custom color here. You can throw colors in there inline just like that. And margin bottom is 5 pixels. Okay, so we'll go down to resume block, not black. Where are we at? Caption, and then table T head. Just kind of the heading block. And we could set a background color of that to be just slightly off-white. So if we go back to our page, notice it's got kind of a gray color. And we'll do the same for each TD and TH. Not the same, but we'll add some padding to those so they're kind of more cushion between that text in there. And if it's not clear, I'm writing this resume block class because elsewhere on our site, we're not going to have other tables, but there may come a time where you do. And then if you have a global table style, which is useful in many cases, you might be conflicting. But what if you want a different table style? Then you need to target it differently. So this is a way to go ahead and do that. Make it more specific. So let's see. Yeah, details are the next look. So background color is white. 6. We'll add some box shadow to the, I'll show you where we're at now. We're down the page to these elements, these things that toggle. They're kind of a neat little built-in accordion kind of thing that comes native with the browser now, which is great. So we'll add some offset on the y-axis and some blur, RGBA of black. And I choose RGBA here because I really want the opacity of this mostly. I don't really write much color in this format personally. You could write all your colors in that way if you wanted to, but I prefer to mix it because I just know the hex codes a little bit more from my years of learning. Padding is 10 pixels on that. So we go back to the details. We got this look and feel. Now they're kind of offset from the page thanks to that padding. And we'll tighten up the padding on this whole thing. We're on the mobile version, so I could just go and show you how that's going to look now. This is kind of what we're designing for at this point. Almost done with the resume stuff. So resume block summary, which is the bit you click on. Essentially this stuff right here, this text is the summary, but in here is the whole details element. So let's do that next. It's going to have cursor, pointer, padding 10 pixels, and border radius of 4 pixels there. And we could add something on hover just to give that a little more oomph. Block summary, again, we can use that pseudo selector, which basically means if it's got a pseudo thing, most of the time it means it's an interactive style or something like that. There are cases where that's not the case though. So we'll give a slight gray on hover, which doesn't really matter on this page on mobile screen, but on the desktop it will. So if we go down, you'll see a slight gray when I go over the top there. Okay, so continuing on, we've got the resume stuff. Now let's work on the blog section. There's not a lot to deal with here, but it does cover some CSS grid, which is fun. We'll start first in the mobile view and work our way down and come back to the desktop view in a second. So I will go, okay. So index blog, if you recall, we kind of gave it a surrounding div that had this index blog class. We're adding the second class of content there to get the padding that will come with that. So you can add as many classes as you want to an element and style it, in any separate way. The more you add, the more that it can get confusing. But that's also in some cases not the case for certain frameworks out there. So we'll say index blog h2 and then target the blog itself. So the actual H2 will be text align left on mobile. Font size 32 pixels. Margin top is 40 pixels. Padding top is 40 pixels. So we get back to this view. We come back here. We've got just kind of this offset from that now. Okay, and then we have our index blog grid. So on mobile, this won't really make much a difference, but we could say display grid. This will kind of coincide on the desktop as well. It'll kind of transcend up there. So on grid, you can have columns and rows, and you can define columns this way. Grid typically columns. And the display is just like displaying block or inline block or flex. So it's just another display pattern. Then there's one FR on mobile is what we're going to do, which just one FR on mobile, which basically spans the whole width. So it's going to be one column in this case. Now you could say as many columns as you want here. So there'd be 4 in that case that are equal parts. And what I want to deal with next is just the general gap. So on mobile, this doesn't matter a ton, but we'll have some gap of 16 pixels. And okay, so we'll see that more on the desktop viewer. That makes sense. The index blog articles, text align left, padding top, 24 pixels, border top. We'll just give each a border. So some of these styles are going to come into play on the desktop view as well. I'm just doing them mobile first just to get it done. It'll all kind of bounce its way up there. Gray, not Gary, gray, light. Index blog header. So this is within the actual header. Font family var, font sans. And that's not actually right. It should just be sans. So these are the headers I'm referring to inside this thing. If that isn't quite clear, allows us to kind of change that up. And then we'll do the same. Header H2, font size var, font size large, margin, reset that margin, line height will be 1. We just want to make sure that's any browser-based line height is just kind of reset to the normal. Then we'll target the p tags in there, index blog header p, and I want that to kind of be its own serif font. So I think we'll say margin 0 on that, font size var small, and then color var gray medium. So we're targeting all p tags in this specific selector here, and I just want to try to make this clear. That's targeting any p tag in the article or header in this case. So just this p tag it's targeting. But then we're coming back through and going down deeper, index blog article header p, and targeting all that stuff. So basically anything that's in that wheelhouse. So it's a little confusing. It's kind of the more specific side of CSS and how it cascades that comes into play there. So font family in this case will be, I want to use sans. We added classes to the p tags here because it's the excerpt. We want to target more than just that global p tag, which is why I would add a class that's more specific so you can actually do that. So font size var, just the base font size. Font family will be serif in this case, so var serif. Finally, we've got our continue button, which is going to basically just be a nice button on mobile, but a inline link on desktop. And I did that on purpose. I wanted to kind of illustrate how far you could take changing styles based on media queries, which is pretty much dramatically. So basically designing a button at this point. So color will be 5 or 6 Fs there for white. Padding 6 pixels, 10 pixels. Font family var sans. And text align center. Text decoration none. Border radius 4 pixels, and then margin top 5 pixels, just to give it some offset. On mobile, this is going to make all the difference. See, we've got buttons now. On desktop, that won't be the case when we establish our styles for that coming up. So let's do that. Actually, I'm going to round out this page since we're already to the end of it, and do the site footer, and then we'll be ready to roll on to the next pages. Text align center for the mobile view. Font size here will be small. Padding we'll just do on the top and bottom, but none on the left and right. Margin reset to 0. Border top will be 1 pixel solid, and we'll set it to a gray color that's lighter. And then the actual color of the text will set to kind of a grayish color as well. So that gives us this kind of centered look on the mobile here view. So on desktop, this will not look great yet. It's kind of just going to be all full width looking feel. So let's deal with that now. On the blog, we can do some work on the desktop view. So if at the very end is where I put all my @media stuff. So it's up to you. You can do it actually inline to each element if you wanted, each selector, but that gets pretty busy and kind of hard to understand. So I tend to separate concerns there. So this is going to be our desktop view. So we're only going to do a little bit different here to make our grid actually a grid. So on desktop, we could probably just do grid template columns and just 3 fluid grid items. So now they're all in line like that, which looks pretty good. And I believe we've already set gap to 16, but I'll just reinsure that it is. Yeah, I think it is. Okay, so the continue button is the main thing I want to change. So index blog, we could just target it this way. Continue, yeah. So we'll just say display inline. We're going to lose all the buttoniness of it. So display inline. Background will be none. We won't have a color that makes any sense for a button, so we'll say primary color. It's more of a hyperlink. So font family will be var serif. And then padding of 0. So notice on desktop it looks like this. If we go back to mobile, we get buttons again. So that's kind of a neat thing you can do. That's pretty wild to change that much just based on a media query. Great. So notice we still have this kind of, it's really tight to that edge. I know we need to add some margin and padding there to get that to look better on the mobile or the desktop view. So we'll add that in a minute. Actually, we will right now. So next to our container, instead of content just being 10 pixels like it is on mobile, we'll actually make it quite a bit more. A neat thing is being able to shorthand and leave out some properties here. I believe this is top and then left and right. So in this case, we can shorthand padding to just be that way. It allows you to add no padding on the top but actually add padding on the left and right. So now I've got this nice thicker margin, wider margin that's easier to read, in my opinion. Looks like I got a little bit of offset we need to add to the blog on the desktop view. If you remember, that's 2 containers. And in my example, this was broken up so you could see part of that purple background. So we'll add that next. One quick thing I want to add though is the blog view on the desktop of the blog content. So this is going to be on the blog pages. It's basically just one little thing we need to add. So I'll just go ahead and add it. And one unique way to basically target a specific page is what we're going to do is add a class to each blog post that's going to be called article. That allows us to target it specifically instead of all of our pages our CSS is linked on. So we'll just add a class to each body tag on each blog post. So 1, 2, and 3. And that allows us to go in and write something like this. So body dot article header h2 font size 48. So what's going on here is that we're explicitly targeting a body tag, and then for each body tag the CSS finds, we're going to assume it has a class called article on it, and it has to be a body tag, and it has to have the class for this to make any sense for the browser to update the styles and whatnot. So then we go deeper and find the header on that page, and then the general H2 on the page to get that font size to be larger. So this only applies to these pages, and it makes this heading quite large. That's one thing to remember and keep in mind there. On our index blog class, the last thing I want to add is just some offset to make sure it is actually rendering the background color between each block. So we've got our index blog here. I just want to add some margin top of maybe like 50 pixels. Why is that adding that way? I think I have a issue with my markup real quick. Yep, I have one too many divs. I think I'm closing this container a wee bit early. There we go. So that's what I wanted to do. I think I've got one extra div. There we go. So this is what I was after. So this offset's now in place. So we've got that a little bit off on the home page specifically, but the rest should be okay, I think. Okay. So that's mostly just to separate the resume from the blog itself. So they're 2 different things. So we can work on the blog pages next, and we're almost ready to wrap this up. So let's go and figure out that. We'll start with mobile first, like we've been doing. And we'll just go and find what's the best place to put that. Okay, so now we can target this just like we were. If you recall, we had the body class article. It allows us to target just that page, and then find the content class, and then I'll do image first of type, which is going to be the feature image of the page typically, just based on the way the markups laid out in the actual design. It's the first one that's always in place. So we're able to kind of just do some offset of 50 pixels on that. We'll set some border radius just to give it a nice little touch and style, and some shadow. So box shadow will be 0, 3 pixels, 16 pixels, kind of a bigger shadow in this case. So RGBA, using black again. I should probably make this a variable. I keep repeating it, similar style, so some weight I could refactor that some. But that gives us this look, which is okay. These photos are quite large. I'm actually rendering them from Unsplash API or whatever, so it's out of my control to kind of make them super cropped and everything. That'd be something you'd have to do with a graphics editor or something with the images. CSS can do a lot with that, but you can only go so far. Body, article, header H2, and font size is 32 pixels. We'll set some margin on the top to be 30 pixels and then just 0 all around. I could just say margin top there, but it's 1. So that gives us a little tighter feel for this title. And then that should actually do it for the articles. It really isn't that much we needed. Finally, I believe the last piece of the puzzle is this contact page. So look at all these fields. Let's actually tackle that next. Just like the article page, I'm going to add a class to the body content called contact. And now we're able to target just that page. So I'm going to do some specific styles for this page, but more in general, it's going to be global because form fields, I'm going to make kind of a global look and feel. So let's add just another block here just to round this all out. So we can say body contact, field set. And I just want to make these basically have no margin by default. So no margin on the bottom. In fact, it's probably better just to write margin bottom 0. And then one extra thing I want to do, there's this legend element that has some default styles built into it. It's kind of more of a semantic thing that groups elements on a page. So this field set and legend is kind of a way to just signify what's this content. I want to actually remove these BR tags. And we can use some offset and margin and whatnot to figure that stuff out on our own. So then we'll have a font size of small. And text transform uppercase. And color will be var. We'll use our primary color. It's kind of just a way to add a heading to the elements. Font weight slightly bolder with 600. Letter spacing is 0.02 I kind of used that one over before. And we'll do margin top. This might make sense to do this way. So margin top's 20 pixels, 0 on the right, 16 pixels on the bottom, 0 on the left. Then we have line height 1, just basically the default. Ensure it's the default. Padding bottom is 5 pixels. Display will be block. Width is 100%, and border bottom is 1 pix solid var gray light. I think I forgot to mention that the order that you write these things does not matter. I actually like personally sorting these by alphabet. So whatever it starts with is typically what I sort by, but sometimes that's not a good thing because it's just hard to read, but I should have mentioned that before. Body.contact, content.page title. We'll add some margin top to that. Just 50 pixels we'll throw out. Okay, so now we've got this all set up. Doesn't really make sense that I have that, but I'm going to go with it. That gives us this giant heading now, and we are able to use some margin on it. Okay, so let's double check why the legend isn't actually working. Contact legend. Oh, you know what? I don't have my global form styles yet, so that's what's up. So this will look good in a second. Let's add our global stuff now. I'll make this more at the top of the file because it's going to relate to everything based around form elements. So let's do that now. I'll go back up to where these globalized things are and just kind of add maybe a divider for forms and controls. Form elements and controls. Okay, so let's say field set. We'll just reset those to margin 0, padding 0. I don't want borders on those either. The defaults on browsers give it that took that stuff away, as you can see. And then we can do the same with the legends. Just make the font size of those large. Font weight is 900 and margin top will be 24 pixels. Okay, and legend first of type, margin top 0. And then we could target all the inputs. So there are a lot of input types. The more traditional ones I tend to use look like this. So we're targeting them this way. We use a type, so it's kind of an attribute selector, but it's still targeting an input element globally. So we're able to target the type specifically in this case. So you need to target them like so. You could add a class to every one of them that you use though and do the same, and that might make sense, but this allows you to kind of never have to add that class if you don't want to, or specific style. Type email, it's a common one. And input type is tel, so telephone number. Input type of date. Text area, select. There we go. Now for all these inputs, we can style those accordingly now. So they're going to have kind of a consistent look and feel, which is the point. I want to target all these for that sake. So we'll say a bit of a border radius, gives it a little rounded edge. Border 1 pixel, solid. We'll do a gray light. Font size will be var font size, or base font size. It's like 16 pixels. Then we'll display every one of those block. Right now they're inline elements. A lot of them are anyway. And then margin 0 for any of that. And we'll just make sure they all go the full width of the browser. So now we got like at least a start to this. Now we can do something similar on the focus state. Just like the hover state, you can have a focus state on elements like this. This pretty much applies to any element if it has a focusable state. And say outline, none. Border, 1 pixel, solid. Var, primary. There we go. Outline none, it's kind of an anti-pattern. It's more, you kind of want to add an outline for accessibility reasons. So if people are tabbing into an input or they're using some sort of device that isn't the norm, maybe they're disabled or have vision impairment, that might be something that they need to see or have to know that they're in a new field typing something in. So we need to be fair to everyone using websites for these things. So I wouldn't recommend going this route. You could maybe just do outline pixel boundary, I think outline inset or something. you can set like a negative value here. And you could say outline, perhaps it's a color. Since I did this on my demo project, I'm going to leave it as is, but I would recommend just reading up on that. It could be a lifesaver in some scenarios. Okay, so let's do the label field. And this is going to be the element that's right above the inputs. So display block. Font size small. Font weight is 600. Margin bottom 2 pixels, just slightly offset, and then margin top is type radio. So we can target radios that are within the label element in this case. Display inline. And then for files, we're going to do something kind of interesting, because file, if you look at it, the default file input, it's just a browser-based thing. There's very little control you have over this look and feel of this button. So what we have to actually do is hide it and then use a label next to it to target it to kind of appear as a button. So it's quite the hack, but it is one that's useful for the sake of making this type of input look like it needs to. Okay, so the way we target the input is this way, into input type file. And we'll actually just use a property display none, and that basically hides it from view. So it's gonna just remove itself. Even though it's rendering in the browser, you can't see it because the CSS is hiding it. So then if we do input file and then this plus sign label, we're able to target the label next to it. And just to show you how that HTML looks, it's right above it. For this to work, sadly, we need to use the label element right below. So if I go back, I'm able to target this at this point because we move that, and it's kind of, that plus sign's assuming it's like one element plus or after the file element. So we're able to target that with CSS that way. That's more advanced, but it is useful in many cases like this. Gray light. Color is var gray dark. Padding is 12 pixels by 16 pixels. We're basically designing another button here. It's a font family, sans serif. And instead of typing that, maybe I'll just use our sans variable. Border radius 4 pixels, cursor pointer. So when we hover over it, we want our pointer finger to show. And then I'll use inline flex as another way to display flex, but it's basically not a full width of the browser. So it's a nice little additional display property. Align items for Flexbox allows you to center it, or you can say start or end. So flex end or flex start, excuse me, flex start. To me, I typically use center. It's just like almost always what I use. And let's save this down. I'll show you the progress. So this is what it's looking like. Now, if we use flex start, you'll notice the text shift itself, I think, up to the top. Well, maybe not in this case, but we just still need that center. If you have it, like added an icon to the button or something like that, that would make that icon shift to the center. And then we'll set a line height 1, margin 10 pixels, and then transition 3 seconds. Border will be 1 pixel solid transparent. So what's happening with this transition property is we're setting this globally. So every type of display, whatever it is, we're just setting some basic transition on everything. And before we've done like specific colors or background color, This is a way to just apply it to all of it. And then we have a border of 1 pixel, which basically won't render a pixel, but we're able to kind of have a hover effect as a result, which is what we're going to type now. So input type file plus label and then hover. And we're able to use this fancy thing called filter, which is not available in every browser, but there's some support for most modern browsers. And instead of changing color, you can change the brightness of something. And there's a lot of different filters you can use. I won't go into too much detail because there's so much stuff to cover, but this is a way to kind of tailor that instead of changing color at all. So 1 pixel solid, and then we actually use a variable gray medium. So I set a transparent border, which is a way to just basically set a value but not actually see it. It'll still fill the space, but it won't actually fill color. So the whole point is so this thing doesn't shift when I hover over it. So that, hopefully that makes sense. So if I remove this line, you'll see this thing kind of shift when I hover over it. It kind of changes the layout a bit, which is pretty gross. So if we add kind of a faux border style, the whole thing just automatically just stays in place, and we're able to get that kind of a fade from that transition, but also just the border doesn't look like it's moving the page up and down at all. All right, so finally we've got button classes, which are going to basically be buttons that we're going to use on the form. But you could use these. I would recommend using these as repeatable things. So the way you would do that is writing classes that kind of just define some defaults for buttons. And we've already used some button styles for like this one in particular, but we could use an actual button class to define the same thing. So color in this case might be gray black or gray dark. Padding 12 pixels, 16 pixels. Font size var, font size medium or small. Font family var sans. Border radius 4 pixels. Cursor is pointer. Display is inline flex. Align items. The center, we'll do some margin just on all buttons. So top will have 10, right will have 5, bottom will have 10, left will have 0. And line height will reset to 1. Transition, we'll add that to all the things. So like I said, this ensures there's transition on everything. Border 1 pixel, solid, transparent. And then font weight will be the 600. That's the base button. So if we were to add that maybe to both of these, we'll have a basic look and feel, but it won't be great. So what I want to add here is class button. So that's the default. It kind of looks like our file field one, but I want to add maybe some coloring to signify different branding based colors. But first, let's add a hover effect. We'll just say the same filter, basically this stuff here. And instead of a border, because I want the border to be brandable, let's add a box shadow that gives it a little bit of offset off the page. So we'll say 3 pixels, 9 pixels, RGBA 9. And then we'll use that black color we keep using. Again, I should make this a variable, but I just want to keep this in line with my code. So now it'll do that kind of thing when you hover it, which is pretty cool. That shadow's pretty gnarly though. Maybe I'll make it something like that. There we go. That was a little more realistic maybe. Maybe a little less opacity. Nice. Okay, so What about branded colors? Let's make a button primary class, perhaps, like just the default button we'll use for action items. So button primary will have our base background color. We'll have var of primary color. And then we'll set the color to white. We can just use the word. Button secondary will have the same thing, just different color for the background. Cool. So that allows us to add a variant class now to the same button class. So button primary will probably be our submit button. Button secondary can be the reset button. So there's reset form or submit form. So you've got that look and feel now. Make sure our font family's set there. Now we've got the right things in place. Very good. Awesome. So our contact page is looking pretty good. We've got one more little thing I want to add just to show some context of some animations to our app, or a little website here, I should say. So let's add some animations now. Animations are interesting. They're their own little, I would say, category in CSS. So I'm going to add that maybe just after some of these basics, maybe before the forms. And I'll just copy this block. Okay, so with animations, there are these things called keyframes, and they allow you to set what's going to happen at a specific point in the animation. So if you've ever used like a software tool like Flash or something in the past, which is old school now, it's kind of a point by point like line. So maybe if you've used video or audio editing, there's keyframes in that in a sense. So I want to add one called fade in. And it's kind of like writing CSS. You do something similar. You define this at keyframes, kind of like a media query, and then you give it an actual unique name. And then there's these from and to properties. And animations can get way more intense than this, but essentially you're going to be animating to and from something in most cases. So for one, it's going to be opacity. So it's just going to go from opacity 0 to 1, and you can set opacity like anything up until 1, basically, from 0 in CSS. So we'll do another one called keyframes. Slide up, and we'll do the same from to, and then transform. This is a little more advanced stuff, so don't worry if you don't understand it, but we're going to set some transform translate 3D, which basically is just going to move an element in a more performant way, as opposed to doing like a margin or a padding. And then we'll set visibility, which is basically bringing something into view. And then we'll say transform translate 3D 0, 0, 0. Okay, so this is sliding up from the bottom is what's happening with this one. Now I want to add some like reusable classes for these as opposed to just adding them uniquely to a specific element. So I'm going to just add those now. It'll allow us to add this stuff to any element in our HTML basically. So the way you actually define an animation is to set it as so. So we define fade in is defined by this keyframes, and we're basically mapping that to the animation property on this class. That allows that animation to kind of initialize. And then you need to set an animation duration, which is whatever you want, basically 0.5 seconds. And then animation fill mode will be both. So we'll kind of follow suit with the slide up. This time we'll do slide up. And I'll just keep the seconds and fill mode. what's unique here is we can add this to, say, our body classes. Maybe it's just everything fades in when it's loaded. So I'll add that just as an additional class, for instance, on our blog posts. And then on our contact page, I think I added one that slid up. So when you visit the page, it will actually slide completely up in view. So slide up. So with that said, we can go back to our main page and hope this works. If I go here, notice it slides up. So that's doing that slide up effect. If I go to home page, nothing really happens on that one, but a blog page should fade in, I believe. There we go. So it's a subtle fade, but it's a nice one. A lot of websites go crazy with animations. I recommend using them tastefully. A website can be very hard to use if it's always animating or something's moving around where you can't even control it. So it's all with a grain of salt. But guys, that wraps up this crash course. I hope it's been useful. I know it's been a long one, but I hope you learned something. We did this all with the mobile first methodology, so I really recommend studying up on responsive web design if you're new to that. It's really useful for making sure your designs encapsulate every device, no matter what device you visit the website on. So you can't really predict what it's going to look like in every browser and in every device, but it is useful to know at least some general guidelines and design patterns you can use to really signify what it's going to look like across the board. So it's really useful in that case. So we've come a long way. So I hope you've learned something. The code here is going to be hosted on the blog and my YouTube channel, so I'll link to that so that you can refer to it and follow along if you want to. I wanted to mention as well as some front-end CSS frameworks that are pretty popular called Bootstrap.com. These kind of enable you to take a ad hoc approach to your styles. So it comes pre-configured with some looks and feel for certain components you might need in your website or your app. Bootstrap's kind of the foundational thing to add to a lot of websites if you need something fast or you need to build a prototype, for instance. My favorite one of late is Tailwind CSS, which is a different way of writing CSS. You essentially just add a bunch of classes to your HTML as opposed to authoring actual CSS. And honestly, this is very, very quick to work with. You get very fast with writing code. And it's just kind of a pattern I've adopted myself of late. So really recommend checking that out. They just released their version 2 at this time, and I'm pretty excited about it. But I haven't covered everything to do with CSS in this course. There's just so much. I think there's like over 500 selectors or patterns you can write with CSS, including animations and stuff like that, where it just gets crazy to see what people can do with it. A site for inspiration you might check out is called CodePen, where there's just examples of CSS and stuff in use. So this is my account, but if we go to like trending stuff, you might see just some wild looking CSS based things that are just built with just basic stuff. And it's crazy to see what can be done with the language that's just so foundational to the web. So again, thanks for watching. I hope you learned something. If you did want to check out my course, it's at hellohtmlcss.com. I have it set up to where you get notified if you subscribe to this actual form here. But there's a lot more about the course there if you want to check it out and subscribe to get more information on it. It's going to be very comprehensive, something like this, but like to the 5th and 10th degree. And we're using HTML and CSS, building some example projects and just walking you through each language and how you use it, and maybe just enable you to do a lot more with it in your day-to-day workflow. So thanks for watching, and I'll see you next time.